The Daughters of Cain by Colin Dexter. Read by Kevin Waitley. On Mondays to Fridays, it was 50-50 whether the postman called before Julia Stevens left for school. So at 8:15 a.m. on the 25th of May, she lingered a while at the dark blue front door of her two-bedroom terraced house in East Oxford. No sign of her postman yet, but he'd be bringing something a bit later. Occasionally she wondered if she still felt just a little love for her ex-husband. Especially had she so wondered when, exactly a year ago now, he'd sent her that card. "Don't forget," he'd written inside. "We had some good times too." If anyone, perhaps, shouldn't she tell him? Then there was Brenda. Dear, precious, indispensable Brenda. Yes, there would certainly be one envelope lying on the welcome doormat when she returned from school that afternoon. No one at school knew of her birthday. She received no birthday greetings from a single soul, either in the staff room or in any of the 6 classes she taught that day. Yet there was, in 5C, just the one pupil who did know Mrs. Smith's birthday. Knew it well, for it was the same as his own. In the previous Sunday Mirror's horoscope column, Kevin Costin had scanned his personal key to destiny with considerable interest. Gemini, maximum mental energy helps you through to a hard-to-reach person who is always close to your heart. Play it cool. Maximum mental energy had never been Kevin's strong point, but if such mighty exertion were required to win his way through to such a person, well, for once he'd put his mind to things. At the very least, it would be an improvement on the brute force and ignorance approach he'd employed on that earlier occasion, when he'd tried to make amorous advances to one of his schoolmistresses, when he'd tried to rape Mrs. Julia Stevens. At the age of 17, today, Kevin Costin was the dominant personality among the 24 pupils of both sexes comprising Form 5C at the Proctor Memorial School in East Oxford, and only rarely was his conduct less than positively disruptive. KC was what was written in red capital letters in the girls' loo. Kevin Costin, karate champion, king of the condoms or whatever. When Mrs. Stevens walked into 5C for the first period on the afternoon of her birthday, the whole class, following a cue from Kevin Costin, rose to its feet in synchronized smartness. The hum of conversation cut immediately, as if some maestro had tapped his baton on the podium. And there was a great calm. "It's only me," he'd spoken into the rusted, serrated entry phone beside the front door. He'd heard a brief, distant whirring, then a click, then her voice. "It's open." He walked up the 3 flights of shabbily carpeted stairs, his mind wholly on the young woman who lived on the top floor. The bone structure of her face, the pallid cheeks, eyes a sludgy shade of green like the waters of the Oxford Canal, nose tip-tilted in slightly concave fashion, disfigured as McClure saw things, by 2 cheap-looking silver rings, one drilled through either nostril. At the second knock, she rose from the bed, straightened her left stocking, and was now opening the door. Within only a couple of minutes, opening her legs too, as she lay back on the constricted width of the bed, her mascaraed eyes focusing on a discoloured patch of damp almost immediately above her head. She'd rarely felt more than a minimal physical attraction for any of her clients, but she was fonder of this particular fellow than any of the others. Indeed, she'd once surprised herself by wondering if, when he died, well, he was nearly 67, she might manage to squeeze out a dutiful tear. It had not occurred to her at the time that there are other ways of departing this earthly life. Had not occurred to her, for example, that her present client, Dr. Felix McClure, former ancient history don of Wolsey College, Oxford, might fairly soon be murdered. Only one communication, it appeared, was awaiting Julia Stevens when she returned home that same day, just after 5 p.m. A brown envelope containing a gas bill. The white envelope, unsealed, lay on the table in the living room, and beside it was an iced cake, the legend, "Happy Birthday, Mrs. Stevens," piped in purple on a white background. Although Brenda Brooks had been Julia's cleaning lady for almost 4 years now, she had never addressed her employer as anything but Mrs. Stevens. Addressed her so again now, just as on the cake in the letter folded inside the NSPCC birthday card. Dear Mrs. S, just a short note to wish you a happy birthday, and I hope you will enjoy your surprise. Don't look at it too closely, as I had a little accident and the icing isn't perfect. My husband decided to pick a fight a few weeks ago, and my doctor thinks he could have broken a bone in my hand, so I can't squeeze the bag very well. Have a lovely day, and I will see you in the morning. Can't wait. Love and best wishes, Brenda. Brackets, Brooks. Julia looked down lovingly at the cake, and suddenly felt very moved and very angry. The injury was hardly of cosmic proportions, yet in its own little world way, the whole thing was so terribly sad. Yet something warmer, something deeper inside herself prompted her to immediate action. She fetched her broadest, sharpest kitchen knife, carefully cut a substantial segment of the cake, and ate it all straight away. The sponge cake was in 4 layers, striated with cream, strawberry jam, and lemon butter icing, absolutely delicious, and she found herself wishing she could share it with someone. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. I didn't say nothing in class, miss, but I want to say happy birthday. Would you like to come along and have a piece of birthday cake with me, Kevin? Just try stopping me, miss. The phone went dead. Julia retraced her steps to the living room where she cut 2 more segments of cake, cut them with the same knife, the broadest, sharpest knife she had in all her kitchen armoury. Much earlier that same day, Detective Sergeant Lewis had found his chief sitting well forward in the black leather chair, shaking his head sadly over the one remaining clue in the Times crossword. Can I help, sir? Extremely improbable. Well, don't you want me to try? Reluctantly, Morse handed over the crossword, and Lewis contemplated the troublesome clue. Kick in the pants. 3 and 5. 3 of the 8 letters were entered. Blank I, blank blank, L, blank S, blank. A short while later, Lewis handed the crossword back across the desk. Nothing had come to mind. After Lewis had gone, to look into some burglaries in North Oxford, Morse stared down at the crossword again. Seldom was it that he failed to finish things off, and that within a pretty smartish time, too. All he needed was a large scotch, and the answer he knew would hit him straight between the eyes. But it was only 8:35 a.m. and it hit him. Scotch! As he swiftly filled in the 5 remaining blank squares, he was smiling beatifically, wishing only that Lewis had been there to appreciate the coup de grace. But Lewis wasn't. And it was only many months later that Lewis was to learn, and then purely by accident, the answer to that clue in the Times crossword for the 25th of May. A day, as would appear in retrospect, on which so many things of fateful consequence were destined to occur. It was to be only the second time that Morse had ever taken over a murder inquiry. "What's wrong with Phillotson?" Lewis had asked as they'd driven down to North Oxford. "It's his wife. She's had something go wrong with an operation." When the super didn't think he could cope with the case. Well, he couldn't, could he? I reckon he'd have been about as competent in this case as a dyslexic proofreader. I like that, sir. Original, is it? Morse grunted. In fact, it had been Superintendent Strange's own appraisal of Phillotson's potential, but as ever, Morse was perfectly happy to take full credit for the bon mots of others. After all, Strange himself had probably read it somewhere, hadn't he? Smoothly, the main door of the maisonette swung open on another case. And as Lewis stepped through the small entrance hall and thence into the murder room, he found himself wondering how things would turn out here. Certainly it hadn't sounded all that extraordinary a case when, 2 hours earlier, Detective Chief Inspector Phillotson had given them an hour-long briefing on the murder of Dr. Felix McClure. McClure was almost 67 at the time of his murder, knifed, as Morse would be able to see for himself, in quite horrendous fashion. The knife, according to pathological findings, was unusually broad-bladed and at least 5 inches long. Of such a weapon, however, no trace whatsoever had been found. Blood, though, oh yes, blood almost everywhere. Blood on almost everything. Blood on the murderer, too? Surely so. Blood certainly on his trainers, with footprints, especially of the right foot, clearly traceable from the murder scene to the staircase, to the main entrance, but thence virtually lost, soon completely lost on the gravelled forecourt outside. Had the murderer left by a car parked close to the main door, or on a bicycle chained to the nearest drainpipe? Inside, well, again, Morse would be able to see for himself. Evidence of extraneous fingerprints? Virtually none. Entry via the main door, with McClure himself admitting whomsoever, not Philipson's word, be it man or woman. Someone known to McClure, then. Most likely. Time? Well, certainly after 8:30 a.m. on the Sunday he was murdered, since McClure had purchased the News of the World and the Sunday Times, like Morse usually did, at about 8 a.m. from the newsagents in Summertown. Each of the 2 news sheets was found, unbloodied, on the worktop in the All-Mod Con's kitchen. Preliminary findings from the pathologist suggested that McClure had been dead for 20 hours or so before being found, at 7:45 a.m. the following morning, by his cleaning lady. Witnesses? Questioning of the tenants of the 8 luxurious apartments comprising Daventry Court, built in Daventry Avenue in 1989, had produced no information of any value. Not all that much to go on, Philipson had admitted, coming to the end of his briefing. Yet all the same, not without some degree of pride, laying a hand on 2 green box files filled with reports and statements, and a plan showing the full specification of McClure's apartment, supplied by Atkinsons, surveyors, valuers and estate agents. The sitting-cum-dining room, the murder room, 12 foot by 17 feet 2, as stated in Atkinson's doubtless accurate specifications, was very much the kind of room one might expect as the main living area of an Oxford Don, divorced, no children. Books almost everywhere, on floor-to-ceiling shelves. Not enough space, really, for the many pictures. For a while, Morse stood by the brown leather armchair, saying nothing. "Do you know how many walking sticks plus umbrellas we've got in the hall stand here?" shouted Lewis from the tiny entrance area. 14. How on earth? For me, Lewis, coincidence in life is wholly unexceptional. You know that by now, surely. Lewis said nothing. He knew well where his duties lay in circumstances such as these, to do the donkey work. So he started to go through all the drawers and all the letters and all the piles of papers and the litter bins, just as earlier Philipson and his team had done. 2 things of interest, Lewis finally informed Morse, and Philipson himself had pointed out the potential importance of the first of these anyway. A black plastic W.H. Smith telephone index. Lewis opened it at random at the letter M. 6 names. Lewis sighed audibly. Still, it might be worthwhile ringing round, provided there were no more than half a dozen or so per page. He pressed the index to K.L. 7, with 6 of them L, and just the 1 K, and that, interestingly enough, entered as the single capital letter K. Who was K when he was at home? Or she? There's one pretty simple way of finding out, suggested Morse. Lewis picked up the phone and dialed, and was answered immediately. "Yeah? What do you want?" A woman's voice. Have I got the right number for K?" "Yeah? She's no here, is she?" "No, obviously not. I'll try again later." "You a dirty old man or something?" Lewis quickly replaced the receiver, the colour rising in his pale cheeks. Morse, who had heard the brief exchange clearly, grinned at his discomfited sergeant. "You can't win 'em all. Waste of time." "Lewis, you learned she was a she, probably a she with the name of K." "I didn't." "A she of easy virtue who old Felix here spent a few happy hours with. Furthermore, she's a local lass, judging by her curly Oxfordshire accent." "But I didn't even get the woman." Morse was silent for a few seconds. Then he looked up, his face more serious. "Are you sure, Lewis? Are you quite sure you haven't just been speaking to the cryptic K herself?" Lewis shook his head, grinned ruefully, and said nothing. Morse had got it wrong, of course. Morse nearly always got things hopelessly, ridiculously wrong at the start of every case, but he always seemed to have thoughts that no one else was capable of thinking. Like now. "Anyway, what's this other thing you've found?" But before Lewis could answer, P.C. Roberts stuck a reverential, unhelmeted head into the room. "There's a Mrs. Wynne Wilson here, sir, from one of the other flats. Says she wants a word. She said Inspector Phillotson didn't really want to know, like. Really? And she's, well, a bit deaf, like. Like what? Pardon? Oh, forget it. Shall I show her in then, sir? What? You know what happened in here, don't you? She'd probably faint, man. Doubt it, sir. She says she was sort of in charge of nurses at some London hospital. Nevertheless, Morse decided to interview Laura Wynne Wilson, should that good lady allow it, in her own ground-floor apartment. And the good lady did so allow. "And what exactly have you got to tell us?" bawled Morse. "Please don't shout at me, Inspector. Deaf people do not require excessive volume. They require only clarity of speech and appropriate lip movement." Lewis smiled sweetly to himself as the small, white-haired octogenarian continued. "What I have to tell you is this. Dr. McClure had a lady friend, a fancy woman, as we used to call it. She came to see him 3 or 4 times in the last month, always at 7:30. And you actually saw her. Actually is a ridiculous word, isn't it? It's a weasel word, Inspector. It means nothing whatsoever. A space filler. Whether I actually saw her, I don't know. What I do know is that I saw her, all right?" Lewis was enjoying the interview immensely. "Can you tell us anything about this woman?" "Let's say I found her interesting." "Why was that?" "Well, for a start, I envied her. She was less than half his age. A good deal less, I shouldn't doubt." "And I wonder," thought Morse, "how old you are, you old biddy." "And I am 83 in December," she continued, "just in case you're wondering." "I was, yes," said Morse, smiling at her, and himself now beginning to enjoy the interview. "The other thing that struck me was that she wasn't at all nice-looking. Quite the opposite, in fact. Very shabbily dressed, miniskirt, right up to—" "The top of her tibia?" supplied Morse. "Absolutely, and she had a big old shoulder bag, too." "I wonder what was in that," thought Morse. "Anything else you can remember?" "She had a ring in her nose. I could see that. For all I know, she could have had 2 rings in her nose." "God help us all," thought Morse. "But I'm not sure about that. As I say, my eyesight isn't what it used to be." "I wonder what it used to be like," thought Lewis. Morse got to his feet. He had only one more question. "Were you looking out of the window on Sunday morning? You know, about the time Dr. McClure was murdered?" "No. On Sunday mornings I always hear the omnibus edition of The Archers on the wireless. That's from 10 to 11. Lovely. I have a really good long soak and hear everything again." "Dangerous thing, that, having a radio in the bathroom," thought Lewis. "It's a dangerous thing, they tell me, having a wireless propped up on the bath rail, but I do so enjoy doing silly things now that I'm old." It had not been much of a contest. Lewis appreciated that. But from his scorecard he had little hesitation in declaring Mrs. Wynne Wilson the winner, way ahead of Morse on points. Quite mistakenly, of course. "What do you make of that, then?" asked Lewis, when the 2 detectives had returned to McClure's apartment. Morse appeared to be disappointed. "I'd begun to think he was a civilized sort of fellow, you know." He gestured vaguely around the bookshelves. "But he wasn't." "Well, you mean this woman he was seeing?" Morse's features reflected disapproval. "Rings in her nose, Lewis. Pretty tasteless, isn't it? Like drinking lager with roast beef." Glancing across at Morse, Lewis saw the chief abstracting a book from a set of volumes beautifully bound in golden leather, a volume of verse by the look of it. And with his usual competence, Lewis resumed his own considerable task. It was Morse who finally broke the silence. "What did you make of her, then, Mrs. Wynne Wilson?" "Mrs., sir?" asked Lewis slowly. Morse threw an interested, inquisitive look at his sergeant. "Go on." "Well, I'd noticed from the start that she wasn't wearing a wedding ring, as you did, of course." "Of course. But I couldn't see any pale skin where the ring had been before she took it off. You noticed that too?" "Me? Your eyesight's far better than mine." "It makes you wonder, though." "You reckon she was making it up about her marriage?" "It wouldn't surprise me, sir." "And apart from that?" "She seemed a pretty good witness. Her mind's pretty sharp. She got you weighed up all right." Lewis, when will you learn? She's a phony from A to Z. It was obvious she wasn't deaf at all. She heard everything I said. She didn't hear me. She didn't want to hear you, Lewis. Well, if you say so, sir. And what about her eyesight? Kept telling us she couldn't see half as well as she used to, but that didn't stop her giving us a detailed description of the woman who came to visit McClure. She knew she'd got a ring in one of her nostrils at 20-odd yards, Lewis. Why don't you think she was making all that up too, sir? Good point. Morse looked down at the carpet briefly. But I don't think so. That bit rang true to me. In fact, I reckon it was the only thing of any value she did come up with. She's not even been a nurse. How can you say that? Miniskirt up to her mid-tibia. Your tibia's below your knee, Lewis. You know that. But she doesn't. Never been near a nursing manual in her life. And, Lewis, most important of all, she claims she's an Archer's addict. But she doesn't even know when the omnibus edition comes on a Sunday morning. Both men became silent again. And soon Lewis was feeling pleased with himself, for he was beginning to realise that the second thing he'd found for Morse was looking far more promising. And Morse himself, with melancholy mien, sat ever motionless, his eyes staring intently at the open book of Latin poetry. When he was a boy, well, when he was 15, Morse had fallen deeply in love. The long relationship had been so wonderful, so formative, so crucial overall, that when, 3 years later, he'd been called up for national service in the army, he'd written a daily letter to his girl, only to learn on his first weekend furlough that one of his friends had been boasting about the sensually responsive lips of his beloved. Morse told himself that he'd finally grown up that weekend, and that was good, but he'd realised too, at the same time, that his capacity for jealousy was pretty nearly boundless. Such thoughts monopolised Morse's mind as he looked again at the poem LV 111. In the margin, McClure had translated it. To totters and toffs, in a levelish ratio, my darling Kay offers her 5 quid fellatio. Near Carfax, perhaps, or at Cowley Road Palais, or just by the turf up any old alley, preferring just slightly some curb-crawling gent, high in the ranks of Her Majesty's government. In the actual text of the poem, McClure had underlined in red biro the words Lesbia nostra, lesbia illa lesbia. My lesbia, that lesbia of mine, that self-same lesbia. Jealousy. It seemed that McClure, like Catullus, had known his full share of it with an ever-flirting, ever-hurting woman with whom he'd fallen in love. And suddenly, unexpectedly, Morse found himself thinking he'd rather like to meet the mysterious Kay. Then, just as suddenly, he knew he wouldn't. Unless, of course, that ambivalent lady held the key to the murder of Felix McClure, a circumstance which, at the time, he suspected was extremely improbable. Morse snapped Catullus too. You didn't hear what I just said, did you, sir? Pardon? Sorry, just pondering. Is it leading anywhere, this, pondering? We're learning quite a bit about this girl of his, aren't we? Building up quite an interesting... The answer's no, then, is it? Morse smiled weakly. Probably. Not like you, that, sir, giving up so quickly. No, you're right. We shall have to check up on her. Find out where she lives. What? Not much of a problem there, said Morse. Really? Pater Street, Lewis, that's where she lives. Named after Walter Pater, you know, the fellow who described the Mona Lisa as a woman who'd learned the secrets of the grave. Pater Street? That's out in Cowley, isn't it? Morse nodded. McClure mentions Cowley in something he wrote here. Morse tapped Catullus. And then there's this. He handed across the postcard he'd found marking the relevant page of notes at the back of the volume. Lewis took the card, and after glancing at the coloured photograph, bluebells in Whiteham Woods, he turned to the back where, to the left of McClure's address, he read the brief message. P Street out this Saturday, either DC or wherever, K. The unsmudged postmark gave the date as the 10th of August. Yes, I see what you mean, sir. They'd arranged to meet at her place, perhaps P something street, on the Saturday. Then on the Wednesday something cropped up, so it had to be DC. Daventry Court or wherever. Probably some hotel room. Morse walked over to the phone, consulting the black index, and dialed a number. Could be Princess Street, sir. That's just off the Cowley Road. No, Lewis. It's Pater Street. Hello. Have I got the right number for Kay, please? You have, but she ain't here, is she? Well, that's what I hoped you'd be able to tell me. You're another dirty old man or something? If I am, I'm a dirty old police inspector, replied Morse, in what he trusted was a cultured, authoritative tone. Oh, sorry. You say she's not there? She's been away for a week, in Spain. Sent me a topless photo of herself from Torremolinos, didn't she? Does she have a client in North Oxford? And if she does, you know his name? Nah. What about her name? She in some sort of trouble? Suddenly the voice sounded anxious, softer now, with the final T voiced on that sort. I could get all this information from Kidlington Police HQ, you know that, surely. I just thought it would save a bit of time and trouble if you answered me over the phone. Then, when we've finished, I can thank you for your kind cooperation with the police in their inquiries. Hesitation now at the other end of the line. Then an answer. Kay Blacksondale. That's K-A-Y. She just signs herself K, the letter K. Is that her real name? Sounds a bit posh. It's her professional name. Her real name's Ellie Smith. What about your name? Friday Banks, that's me. Have you got another name? No. That all? Do you like bluebells, Miss Banks? Bluebells? She does. Kay does. But me, I'm a red rose girl, Inspector, if you think you're sending me a bunch of flowers. You never know, said Morse, as he winked across at Lewis. That all? She repeated. Just your address, please. You have to know? An aspirated have. Yes. It's 35 Princess Street. And now it was Lewis's turn as he winked across at Morse. Morse's face, after he'd cradled the phone, betrayed a suggestion of satisfaction, but after a short while a stronger suggestion of dissatisfaction. Well, sir, she said McClure's girlfriend was in Spain when he was murdered, didn't she? It's impolite to eavesdrop on telephone conversations. Lewis nodded. Interesting, too. I felt sure you were going to ask her to send you the topless photo. Do you know, said Morse quietly, I think, looking back on it, I should have done exactly that. I must be getting senile. Anyway, you can cross her off the list of suspects. Perhaps she was never on it in the first place. You see, I don't think it was a woman who murdered McClure. We shall still have to see her, though. Oh, yes, but the big thing we've got to do is learn more about McClure. The more we learn about the murdered man, the more we learn about the murderer. Music to Lewis's ears. Now, continued Morse, just tell me about this second great discovery of yours. Just give me 10 more minutes, nearly ready. Morse ambled somewhat aimlessly round, but nothing, it appeared, was able to hold his attention for long. For Lewis, this brief period of time was profitable. His little dossier, well, 3 items held together with a paperclip, was now, he thought, complete. Interesting. He was pleased with himself, trusted that Morse would be pleased with him too. When for a second time she'd put down the phone, Eleanor Smith stared at her own carpet, in this case a threadbare, tastelessly floral affair. The calls hadn't been unexpected, no. Ever since she'd read of McClure's murder, she'd half expected, half feared that the police would be in touch. Not that she could help, she knew nothing. And whatever happened, she couldn't be a suspect. On that Sunday she'd left Oxford at 6:30 a.m, on a coach trip to Bournemouth. Hadn't got back either till 9:45 p.m, so there. And 34 witnesses could testify to that, 35 if you included the driver. And yet she couldn't help worrying about who would want to murder such an inoffensive fellow as Felix. Was there some history, some incident, some background in Felix's life about which she knew nothing? Sure to be, really. Not that he'd ever hinted. Then it struck her. There was that one thing, just over a year ago, late May, or was it early June, when that undergraduate living on Felix's staircase had jumped out of his third-floor window and broken his neck. That undergraduate. Who was she fooling? Poor Matthew. Not that she'd had anything to do with that either. Well, she'd fervently prayed that she hadn't. After all, she'd only met him once, when Felix had become so furiously jealous. Jealousy, at his age, 41 years older than she was. Yes, a father figure. A foster father, perhaps. Not a bloody stepfather, though. Christ, no. She looked at herself in the mirror of the old-fashioned dressing table. Her sludgy green eyes stared back at her with an expression of dullness and dishonesty. Dishonesty? Yes. The truth was, she probably hadn't given a sod for McClure, not really. Come to think of it, he'd been getting something of a nuisance. Far too possessive. Yes, if she were honest with herself, she was glad it was all over. And as she continued to stare at herself, she was suddenly aware that the streaks of crimson in her hair were perhaps only a physical manifestation of the incipient streaks of cruelty in her heart. Morse had finished the previous evening with 4 pints of best bitter at the King's Arms in Banbury Road, and had followed this with a half-bottle of his favourite Glenfiddich at his bachelor flat in the same North Oxford. Unsurprisingly, therefore, he'd not exactly felt as fit as a Stradivarius when Lewis had called the following morning, and it was Lewis who now drove out to Leicester. As the Jaguar reached the outskirts of that city, Morse was looking again through the items which Lewis had seen fit to salvage from McClure's apartment, and which, glory be, Morse had instantly agreed could well be of importance to the case. First was a cutting from the Oxford Mail dated Tuesday the 8th of June, 14 months earlier. Drugs link with Dream Son's suicide. At an inquest held yesterday, the coroner recorded a verdict of suicide on the death of Mr. Matthew Rodway, a third-year undergraduate reading English at Oxford. Dr. Felix McClure, one of Rodway's former tutors, was questioned about a letter found in Rodway's rooms, containing the sentence, "I've had enough of all this." Dr. McClure agreed with the coroner that the most likely explanation of events was that Rodway had been driven to take his own life. Pathological evidence had suggested that Rodway had taken drugs on a regular basis. Matthew's mother, however, is reluctant to accept the coroner's verdict. Speaking from her home in Leicester, Mrs. Mary Rodway wished only to recall a bright, caring son who had every prospect of success before him. Morse turned once again to another cutting taken from the Oxford Times of Friday the 18th of June. This article was flanked by a photograph of Dr. F. McClure, a clean-shaven, rather mournful-looking man, pictured in full academic dress. Pastoral care defended. Following the latest in a disturbing sequence of suicides, Dr. Felix McClure, former senior lecturer in ancient history at Wolsey College, has expressed his disappointment that so many have rushed into the arena with allegations of indifference and neglect. More should be done, he told our reporter. We all agree on that score, but there should also be some recognition of the university's present concern and commitment. You'll soon know those things off by heart, ventured a well-pleased Lewis, as he braked gently outside number 14 Evington Road South, then decided to continue into the drive, where the low-profile tyres of the Jaguar crunched into the deep gravel. Mrs. Mary Rodway, a smartly dressed, slim-figured, pleasantly featured woman in her late 40s, seemed quite willing to talk, at least for a start. He was quite wrong, the coroner, you realise that. She lit another cigarette and inhaled deeply. He made it all sound so uncomplicated. It's difficult to put it into words, Inspector, but you see, there are causes of things and symptoms of things, and in Matthew's case, this drugs business was a symptom of something. It wasn't a cause. She inhaled on her cigarette with such ferocity that she seemed to Lewis hell-bent on inflicting some irreparable damage to her respiratory tract. Morse looked around the large lounge. Much space on the walls was devoted to pictures, prints of still-life paintings by Braque, Matisse, Picasso, photographs and watercolours of great buildings and palaces, including Wolsey College, Oxford. But virtually no people. It was as though those things, so frequently resorted to by Mrs. Rodway in her conversation, were now figuring more prominently than people. "You knew Dr. McClure, I think," he said. "He was Matthew's tutor." "Didn't he have rooms on the same staircase?" "The first year and the third year. Matthew was out of college his second year." "Where was that? Do you remember?" Did Lewis observe a flicker of unease in Mary Rodway's eyes? Did Morse? "I'm not sure." "Oh, it doesn't matter. Sergeant Lewis here can check up on that easily enough." But she had her answer now. It was in East Oxford somewhere. Cowley Road, was it? Morse continued his questioning, poker-faced, as if he had failed to hear the tintinnabulation of a bell. What did you think of Dr. McClure? Very nice man. He took a real interest in Matthew. Morse produced a letter and passed it across to Mrs. Rodway, a single, handwritten sheet on the pre-printed stationery of 14 Evington Road South, Leicester. It was dated the 2nd of June, the day after the coroner's verdict on Matthew Rodway's death. Dear Felix, I was glad to talk to you on the phone, however briefly. I was so choked I could hardly speak to you. Please do as we agreed. If you find anything else among M's things which would be upsetting, please get rid of them. This includes any of my letters he may have kept. He had 2 family photos in his room, one a framed one of the 2 of us. I'd like both of them back. I must thank you for all you tried to do for Matthew. He often spoke of your kindness, as you know. I'm so sorry I can't go on with this letter any more. Sincerely yours, Mary. As Mrs. Rodway read through the letter, Lewis turned his head away from the exhalation of smoke. He was not overmuch concerned with the risks of passive smoking, but it must have some effect. It already had its effect on the room here, where a thin patina of nicotine could be seen on the emulsioned walls. Just above one of the radiators, an oblong of pristinely bright magnolia served to emphasize a slight neglect of household renovation. Did Dr. McClure find anything in Matthew's rooms? Morse asked. I don't know. Would he have told you if, let's say, he found some drugs? I doubt it. Did he think Matthew was taking drugs? It was hard for her to say it, but she said it. Yes. Did you ever find out where he got his drugs from? No. Do you think drugs were available inside the college? I don't know. Would Dr. McClure have known? I suppose he would. Do you blame anyone about the drugs? I'm in no position to blame anyone. Do you blame yourself? Don't we all blame ourselves? Thank you. You've been very kind, Mrs. Rodway. The 3 of them rose to their feet. Did you get to university yourself? Asked Morse. No, I left school at 16. Got a good job. Met a nice boss, became his PA, and he married me. He's got a weakness for PAs. He ran off with his last one 4 years ago. Morse nodded. When exactly did he leave? November the 5th, bonfire night. Not likely to forget the date, am I? Not quite 4 years ago, then. Mrs. Rodway made no further reply. The Turf Tavern, nestling beneath the old walls of New College, Oxford, may be approached from Holywell Street via a narrow, irregularly cobbled lane of medieval aspect. Inside, the true connoisseur of beers can enjoy a finely cask-conditioned pint in a blessedly Muzak-free environment. Morse had resisted several pubs which, en route from Leicester, had paraded their credentials, but as Lewis knew, the time of drinking and of thinking was surely soon at hand. He'd driven to the far end of Broad Street, where, as ever, there appeared to be no prospect of leaving a car legitimately. "Oh, don't worry, Lewis. All the traffic wardens know my car. They'll think I'm on duty." Morse approached the bar, searching through his pockets in unconvincing manner. "Do you still sell cigarettes?" The landlord, Biff, pointed to the machine. "You'll need the right change." "Ah, have you got any change on you by any chance, Lewis?" When at the table in the inner bar, Morse was finally settled behind his pint, his second pint. He took from his pocket the used envelope on which Lewis had seen him scribbling certain headings on their return to Oxford. "Let's just consider where we are," Morse began. "We've discovered a couple of possible links in this case so far, McClure's fancy woman and the Rodway woman, the mother of one of his former pupils. Now, neither of them comes within 1,000,000 miles of being a murderer, I know that, but they're both adding to what we know of McClure himself, agreed? He's a conscientious don who's got every sympathy with the young people he comes into contact with. A man who met Matthew's mum and probably slipped in between the sheets with her." Lewis shook his head vigorously. "You can't just say that sort of thing." "Then why not? How the hell do you think we're going to get to the bottom of this unless we make the odd hypothesis here and there? You don't know? Well, let me tell you. We think of anything that's unlikely, that's how. Any bloody idiot can tell you what's likely." "If you say so, sir." "I do say so," snapped Morse. Except that what I say is not particularly unlikely, is it? They obviously got on pretty well, didn't they? Lewis lifted his eyebrows. All Christian name, palsy-walsy stuff, wasn't it? Then there's this business of her husband leaving her in November, a month or so after her precious Matthew had gone up to Oxford. Things may well have been the other way round, eh? She may have left him, and it was only then that he started playing around with his new PA. Anyway, it doesn't matter, does it? It's got bugger all to do with McClure's murder. There was, Lewis began slowly, a light-coloured patch on the wall. Ah, glad you noticed that. Fiver to a cracked piss-pot, that was a picture of McClure. That's why she took it down. She didn't want us to see it. She wouldn't have taken a photo of her son down, would she? Where's the point of that? Very unlikely. Well, you just said that's exactly what we're looking for, sir. Something unlikely. Morse was spared any possible answer to this astute question by the arrival of the landlady, a slimly attractive brunette with an extra sparkle in her eyes when she greeted Morse. I've seen you for a little while, Inspector. How's things, beautiful? Biff came over to join them, and the four sat together for the next 10 minutes. Morse, after explaining that the word turf had appeared in the margin of one of McClure's books, asked whether they would have known the murdered man if they'd seen him in the pub. No. Whether they'd ever seen the young man from Wolsey who'd committed suicide. Don't think so. Whether they'd ever seen a young woman with rings in her nose and red streaks in her hair. Hundreds of them. Yet the landlady had one piece of information. There's one of the chaps comes in here sometimes who has a scout on that staircase when, I heard him talking to somebody about it. Yeah, Biff was remembering too. I only started coming in here after he moved to the Pit Rivers, I think it was. Well, only just up the road, isn't it? He still comes? Biff considered. Haven't seen him for a little while now you come to mention it. You, love? The landlady shook her pretty head. You know his name? Asked Lewis. Brooks. Ted Brooks. It was Lewis who spotted it first, as he and Morse left the Turf Tavern, the traffic warden's notice stuck beneath the near side windscreen wiper of the unmarked Jaguar. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Mary Rodway had assembled the new passepartout for the picture frame. Like most things in the room, she agreed, it had been getting very dingy, but it looked splendid now as she carefully replaced the remounted photograph, standing back repeatedly and adjusting it to the millimetre. That photograph of herself and her son, which Felix had sent her as she'd requested. At 10 a.m. the following day, Morse and Lewis were escorted through the great quad at Wolsey College and away to the left of it into what seemed to Morse the unhappily named Drinkwater Quad. They thanked the deputy bursar and made their way to Staircase G, where a surprise was in store for them. Not really a scout at all, more a girl guide. Susan Ewers was friendly and helpful, a married woman, no children yet, who was very happy to have the opportunity of supplementing the family income. The majority of scouts were women now, she explained. Only 3 or 4 men still doing the job at Wolsey. In fact, she'd taken over from a man who'd left to work at the Pit Rivers Museum. Mr. Brooks, was that? Asked Morse. Yeah, do you know him? Heard of him. Please, go on. Her duties, well, everything, really. The immediate area outside the entrance, the porchway, the stairs, the 8 sets of rooms, hoover all the floors, dust around, polish all the brasswork, that sort of thing. Willingly she showed the detectives the rooms at G4 on the 2nd floor of her staircase, where until 14 months previously the name of Dr. F. McClure had been printed in black Gothic capitals beside the Oxford blue double doors. But if Morse had expected to find anything of any significance in these rooms, he was disappointed. Just standard accommodation. It reminded him of his own unhappy, unsuccessful days at Oxford. You didn't know Matthew Rodway? He asked. No, I didn't come till September last year. Do people on the staircase still take drugs? Mrs. Ewers was taken aback by the abruptness of Morse's question. Well, they still have parties, you know. But you've never seen any evidence of crack, speed, ecstasy? No, she said, almost truthfully. As they walked down the stairs, Lewis pointed to a door marked with a little floral plaque, Susan's pantry. Can we take a look inside? She unlocked the door and led the way into a fairly small, high-ceilinged room, Buckets, mops, bin liners, black plastic bags, transparent polythene bags, rows of cleaners and detergents, everything meticulously antiseptically clean. Morse had little doubt that if cleanliness were next to saintliness, Susan Ewers was probably on the verge of beatification. So what? He was aware that his thought processes were hardly operating vivamente that morning, and it was Lewis who, as so frequently, was the catalyst. "What's your husband do, Mrs. Ewers?" Well, at the minute he's unemployed, actually. He was made redundant." "When was that?" "Last year." "When exactly?" If Morse could ask such questions, why not Lewis? "Last, August." "Good thing you getting the job, then. Help tide things over, like." Lewis smiled sympathetically, and Morse smiled gratefully. "Bless you, Lewis, bless you." Gestalt, that's what the Germans call it. That flash of unified perception which is more than the sum of the parts, into which it may be logically analysable. Parts in this case, like drugs and scouts and a suicide and a murder and a staircase and changing jobs and not having a job and retirement and money and the times and dates. Yes, especially times and dates. Morse moved over to the door and put his penultimate question. "Do you have a mortgage?" "Yeah." "Big one?" She nodded miserably. As they moved out of Susan's pantry, Morse glanced back at the door, now closed again, fitting flush enough with the jambs on either side, but with a 2-centimetre gap showing between the bottom and the linoed floor of the landing. He asked his last question simply and quietly. "When did the envelopes first start coming, Susan?" And Susan's eyes jumped up to his, suddenly flashing the unmistakable sign of fear. On Friday, the 2nd of September, 2 days after her return to Oxford from her summer holiday in Switzerland, Julia Stevens made her way on foot to the Churchill Hospital, where her appointment at the clinic was for 11 a.m. "How are you feeling?" asked Basil Shepstone, a large, balding, slightly stooping South African. "You want me to undress?" "I'd love you to undress," he said. "No need today, though. Next time I'll insist." His friendly brown eyes were suddenly sad, and he reached across to place his right hand on her shoulder. "You want the good news first, or the bad news?" "The good news." "Well, your condition's fairly stable, and that's very good news." Julia found herself swallowing hard. "And the bad news?" "Shall I read it?" It says, "In the event of any deterioration, however, we regret to inform Mrs. Stevens that her condition is inoperable." She sighed deeply and looked at him, knowing that she loved him for everything he tried to do for her. "How long?" she asked simply. "A year?" "Could be." 6 months. "Anyone who predicts something like this is a fool." "Would you give up work if you were me?" "Fairly soon, I think. Yes." After Mrs. Stevens had left, the consultant took a handkerchief from his pocket and quickly wiped his eyes. What was he supposed to say? Because it never really did much good to lie. He blamed himself, for example, for lying to the woman who died only 2 days previously, lying to Mrs. Phillotson. Not much difference in the case histories. No hope in either. On Saturday, the 3rd of September, the morning after his visit with Lewis to Wolsey, and the statement made immediately thereafter by Susan Ewers, Morse sat in the Summertown Health Centre. A mild cold had, as usual with Morse, developed into a fit of intermittently barking bronchitis. Clutching a prescription, he was about to leave when he remembered the Times left in his seat in the waiting room. Returning, he found that his earlier companions had now been joined by a slatternly-looking, slackly dressed young woman with rings in her nostrils, a woman to whom Morse took an immediate and intense dislike. Predictably so. He picked up his newspaper without a word, though not without a hurried glance into the woman's dull green eyes, the colour of the Oxford Canal along by Wolvercote, and if Morse had waited there only a few seconds longer, he would have heard someone call her name. "Eleanor Smith!" But Morse had gone. She had already got the address of an abortion clinic, but one of her friends informed her that it was now closed. So she'd have to find some other place, and the quack ought to be able to point her somewhere not too far away, surely. That's exactly the sort of thing quacks were there for. In a marked police car standing on a strictly doctors-only lot in the centre's very restricted parking area, Lewis sat thinking and waiting. Waiting, in fact, quite patiently, since the case appeared to be developing in a reasonably satisfactory way. Suspicion, prima facie, could and should now be levelled at Mr. Edward Brooks, the man who had been Susan Muir's immediate predecessor as scout on Staircase G in Drinkwater Quad. Why? Morse's unusually simple and unspectacular hypothesis had been stated as follows. It should be assumed in all probability that Brooks had played a key role, albeit an intermediary one, in supplying a substantial quantity of drugs to the young people living on the staircase, including Matthew Rodway. That Rodway's suicide had necessarily resulted in some thorough investigation by the college authorities, that McClure had become deeply involved, indeed had probably been the prime mover in seeing that Brooks was removed from his post, coincidentally at the same time as McClure's retirement. That, as Susan Ewers had now testified, the former scout had continued his trafficking in drugs, and that this information had somehow reached McClure's ears. That McClure had threatened Brooks with exposure, disgrace, criminal prosecution, and almost certain imprisonment. That, finally, in a showdown at Daventry Court, Brooks had murdered McClure. Such a hypothesis had the merit of fitting all the known facts, and if it could be corroborated by the new facts which would doubtless emerge from the meeting arranged for this afternoon at the Pitt Rivers Museum, yes. But there was one potential fly in the ointment, as Lewis had expressed himself half an hour earlier. Brooks was ambulanced off that Sunday with a heart attack. Wouldn't you be likely to have a heart attack if you'd just killed somebody? We can check up straight away at the hospital. All in good time, Morse had said. You'll have me in hospital if you don't get me down to the health centre. But here came Morse at last, 10:40 a.m., cum prescription. And Lewis could predict the imminent conversation. Chemist, just round the corner, Lewis. If you'd just nip along and I'd be grateful. Only problem, searching pockets. I seem... Lewis was half right, anyway. There's a chemist just around the corner, if you'd be so good. I don't know how much these wretched Tories charge these days, but... Searching pockets. Here's a tenner. Lewis left him there on the reserved parking lot, just starting the Times crossword, and walked happily up to Boots in Lower Summertown. What was happening to Morse? The other appointment on Julia Stevens' agenda the previous day had been postponed. On her arrival at the Old Parsonage Hotel, a telephone message was handed to her. Mrs. Brooks would not be able to make the lunch. She was sorry. She would ring later if she could. Please, not to ring her. Brenda Brooks rang, in a hurry, she'd said, just before the 9 o'clock news on BBC One. Could they make it the next day? Saturday? A bit earlier? 12 noon, say? After she'd put down the phone, Julia sat silently for a while, staring at nothing. A little bit odd, that. Brenda ringing almost certainly from a telephone box when she had a phone of her own in the house. It would be something, everything, to do with that utterly despicable husband of hers. As Brenda Brooks made her bus journey down to Carfax that Saturday morning, her mood was an amalgam of anticipation and anxiety. She was a good 10 minutes early, and in leisurely but tremulous fashion she crossed the Broad and walked up St. Giles, and then, waiting for the traffic lights just before Keble Road, she'd quickly checked yet again that the letter was there in her handbag. For a few moments this letter almost assumed as much importance as that second thing. The event which had caught her up in such distress, such fear, since the previous Sunday, when her husband had returned home, the stains on his shirt and grey flannel trousers almost adequately concealed by a beige summer cardigan, new from M&S. And it was only later that she'd noticed the soles of his trainers. Opposite her, the green man flashed and the bleeper bleeped, and Mrs. Brenda Brooks walked quickly over to the Old Parsonage Hotel at No. 1 Banbury Road. "What's it to be, then?" Julia Stevens asked, minutes later, as they looked through the menu. Brenda shook her head. "I'm sorry, I just can't eat anything. I'm all full up, Mrs. Stevens, if you know what I mean." Julia was too sensible to argue, and half an hour later she'd been put in the picture about Ted Brooks. She'd known all about the verbal abuse which had led to a broken heart, and now she learned of the physical abuse which had led to a broken hand.
"I'm so wicked. You know why? I wished," Brenda whispered closely in Julia's ear, "I wished him dead. Can you believe that?"
"Most people in your position would have murdered him, you dear old thing," said Julia, but only to herself. And suddenly the realization that such a viciously cruel man should have ruined the life of such a sweet and lovable woman made her so very angry, yet at the same time so very much in control. Was it perhaps that the simultaneous keeping of her own secret with the hearing of another's was an unsuspected source of strength? But Julia had no opportunity of pursuing this interesting line of thought, for Brenda now opened her handbag and passed over the letter she'd received the previous Tuesday, not through the post, but pushed by hand through her letterbox.
"Just read it, please. No need to say anything."
As Julia put on her school-marmish spectacles, she was aware that the woman seated beside her was now in tears.
"Dear Mum, dearest Mum, it's been a long time, hasn't it? I didn't really want to write, but I can't talk about it. I just can't. It's about why I left home, and how I couldn't really ever tell you about it. I'm writing now because my friend at the hospital told me about him. She said he's a lot better and going home soon. And all I want you to do is let him get very much worse again. And don't look after him. Just let him die. That's what I want, because he bloody deserves it. I never had the guts to tell you why I left, but I've got to tell you now. So here goes. I was 13 when it started. We had the flu together, him and me, and so you remember we were both in bed when you went off cleaning one Thursday morning. You see, I even remember the day of the week. And he came into my bedroom about 11, brought me a cup of Bovril, and he said how nice looking I was getting, and what a nice little figure I was getting, and all that bullshit, and how proud he was to have a daughter like me, well, a stepdaughter. And then he put his arm round me and started rubbing my neck and back through my pyjamas, told me to relax because that would do me good. I didn't know what to do because, for a start, I just thought he was being affectionate and I didn't want to upset him. Please, Mum, try to understand. I just felt scared then, like that first day in school when I got kept in for what wasn't my fault at all. But I thought it was my fault. Oh, Mum, I'm not explaining things very well. All I know is that I'd done what he wanted before I had a chance of thinking what I was doing, and afterwards he kept on saying it was me who'd started it all, not him. And I got scared stiff you'd find out. And it was like blackmail those next 3 awful years when he made me do everything he wanted. Well, that's it, Mum. I wonder what you're thinking. He's a shit, and I never want to see him again unless it's to stick a bloody great big knife in his great fat gut and watch him squirm and squeal like the great fat pig he is. And if you want any help with sticking the fucking pig, you just let me know, 'cause I'll be only too glad to help. Julia turned over the page, but the last part of the letter was missing. Lewis, on his way for an appointment with the house matron of Woolsey, had dropped Morse in the Broad, where the chief inspector had swilled down a double dosage of penicillin pills with a pint of Hook Norton in the White Horse, before making his way to the Pitt Rivers Museum of Ethnology and Prehistory for his own appointment. He knocked on the door of the administrator, capital A. "Coffee?" she invited. "No, thanks, I've just had some." "Some beer, you mean?" "Is it that obvious?" "Yes." She was a tall, slim woman in her mid-40s, with prematurely white hair and attractively diffident smile about her lips. "Some women," began Morse, "have an extraordinarily well-developed sense of smell." But then he stopped. For a second or two he'd anticipated a little mild flirtation with Jane Cotterell. Clearly it was not to be, though, for he felt her clear, intelligent eyes upon him, and the tone of her voice was unambiguously no-nonsense. "How can I help you?" For the next 10 minutes she answered his questions. Brooks had joined the 8-strong team of attendants at the museum almost exactly a year ago. He was, in the administrator's view, competent in his job, not frightened of work, punctual, reasonably pleasant with the public, private sort of person, though, something of a loner. There were certainly some of his colleagues with slightly more endearing qualities. "If you'd known what you know now, would you have appointed him?" "No." "Have you still got his references?"
The administrator produced a folder marked Brooks E, and Morse looked through the half-dozen sheets it contained. He read the last item a second time, slowly. Dear Madam, I understand that Mr. Edward Brooks has applied to you for the post of assistant attendant at the museum. Brooks has worked as a scout at Wolsey College for almost 10 years, and I can recommend to you his experience and diligence. Yours sincerely, Felix McClure, Doctor. Well, well. Thank you, said Morse. Thank you for your patience and your time. You're a very important person, I can see that. Really? How? Well, you've got a capital A for a start. Then you've got a wall-to-wall carpet, and for all I know, you've not only got a parking space, you've probably got one with your name on it. No name on it, I'm afraid. Still, what about you? Oh, I've only got a little carpet with a great big threadbare patch where my megapodic sergeant stands. Is there such a word, megapodic? I'll look it up when I get home. Where is your home? Top of the Banbury Road, anywhere near you? Jane Cotterell sat at her desk for several minutes after the door had closed behind Morse. She shouldn't really have said that about the beer, silly of her. Why, she could just do with a drink herself, and it would have been nice if he'd asked her out for lunchtime gin. She felt herself wishing that he'd forgotten something, a folding umbrella or a notebook or something. But as she'd observed, the inspector had taken no notes at all. Julia handed back the letter. I think she hates him even more than you do. Brenda nodded miserably. I must have loved him once, though, mustn't I? I suppose he was... Well, after Sid died, he was just there, really. I suppose I needed something, somebody, and Ted was there. And he made a bit of a fuss of me, and I was lonely, and after that... But it doesn't matter any more. For a while there was a silence between the two women. Mrs. Stevens? Yes? What about this other thing? What am I going to do about it? Please, help me, please. It was with anger that Julia had listened to Brenda's earlier confidences. With anger, too, that she'd read the letter. The man was an animal. She might have known it. But the possibility that he was a murderer. Could Brenda have got it all ridiculously wrong? Julia had never really got to know Ted Brooks. Only once had she gone round to the Brookses' house, when Brenda had been stricken with some stomach bug. When, as she'd left, Ted Brooks's hand had moved, non-accidentally, against her breasts as he was supposedly helping her on with her mackintosh. The contents of the letter, therefore, had come as less of a shock than may have been expected. But Brooks a murderer? She looked across with a sort of loving distress at the busy, faithful little lady who had been such a godsend to her. She felt an overwhelming surge of compassion for her, and she was going to do everything she could to help. Of course she was. It was 2:20 when Julia's taxi dropped Brenda, not immediately outside her house, but very close, just beside the grocer's shop on the corner. Don't forget, Brenda. Telephone just before 9, and don't say anything or do anything before then, agreed? On her way home, Julia spotted the Oxford Mail placard outside a newsagent's in the Cowley Road. Police hunt murder weapon. And she asked the driver to stop. As Morse had expected, Lewis was already sitting waiting for him outside the museum. Learn anything new, sir? Wouldn't go so far as to say that, no. How about you? Interesting. In his third year, Matthew Rodway was sharing a room with another undergraduate called Ashley Davies. But not for long, it seems. Davies got himself booted out of college. The plot thickens. Bad blood, perhaps? Ruined his chances, certainly. Davies was expected to get a first. I've got his address, living with his parents in Bedford. You go and see him, then. I can't do everything myself. What's wrong? Asked Lewis quietly. I don't know. My chest's sore, my legs ache, my head's throbbing, I feel sick, I feel sweaty. It's the wrong question, isn't it? You mean what's right? Don't you want to see Ashley Davies? Morse hesitated. No, there's something much more important for me to do this afternoon. Go to bed, you mean? Slowly, resignedly, Morse nodded. And try to fix something up with Brooks. Time we paid him a little visit, isn't it? Monday. What's wrong with tomorrow? That'll be exactly a week after he murdered McClure, won't it? Brenda Brooks was relieved to be home before him,
to have time for a cup of tea, to try to stop shaking. After the first inevitable bewilderment, after the uncomprehending questions and the incomprehensible answers, her immediate reaction had been to wash the blood-stained clothing. But instead she had followed the fierce instructions given from the invalid's bed that the clothes be carted off to the rubbish dump and that the affair never be referred to again. Automatically almost, between sips of tea, she wiped the tongs clean of any tannin stain and replaced them in the drawer to the right of the sink, in the compartment next to the set of beautifully crafted knives which her sister Beryl had given her for her first wedding. Knives of many shapes and sizes which lay there before her in shiny and sharpened array. The phone rang at 2:45 p.m. The Pitt Rivers Museum. The phone rang again just before 3 p.m. Mrs. Stevens. Is he home yet? No. He's still at the snooker club. Good. Now listen. The front door slammed at 3:20 p.m, when, miraculously as it seemed to Brenda, the shaking in her hands had ceased. The museum just rang. The lady wanted to know where you were. Kind of her, wasn't it? Kind, was it? Fuck. Only wanted to know when I'd be back, that's all. Must be short-staffed. You thought people would be glad of a job like that with all this unemployment. You know fuck all about it. Look at you. You go out for that bloody teacher. Bloody slave labour, that's what you are. 4 quid an hour, Christ. Brenda made no answer. Mrs. Stevens had paid her £10 for 3 hours, 2 mornings a week, and Brenda knew why that was. For her employer had told her exactly where she stood on the financial ladder, 1 rung from the bottom. In fact, Mrs. Stevens had even been talking that lunchtime of having to get rid of her B-registration Volvo. It wasn't that the sale would materially boost her current account, but it would mean a huge saving on road tax, insurance, servicing, repairs, MOT, garaging, in all about £800 a year. So why keep it? That's what Julia had asked Brenda. She would have been more honest if she'd told Brenda why she was going to sell it. But that lunchtime, at least the telling of secrets, had been all one-way traffic. After dropping off the drooping Morse, Lewis returned to Kidlington HQ, where, before doing anything else, he looked at the copy of the Oxford Mail that had been left on Morse's desk. Murdered Don. The police are appealing for help in their inquiries into the brutal murder of Dr. Felix McClure. In spite of an extensive search, the murder weapon has not been discovered, but it is believed the murderer may have thrown the knife away as he left the scene. The knife may be of the sort used for cutting meat, probably with a blade about 2 inches broad and 5 to 6 inches in length. If found, it should be left untouched, and the police informed immediately. Later that afternoon it was to be the BBB route, Bicester, Buckingham, Bedford. Fortunately for Lewis, the Davies' detached residence was on the western outskirts of Bedford, and the door was answered by Ashley Davies himself. After only a little skirmishing, Davies had come up with his own version of events which had preceded the showdown between himself and Matthew Rodway, and Dr. Felix McClure. Everything was okay between Matthew and me until this woman, joined our transcendental meditation class. I just couldn't take my eyes off her. I took her out twice, once to the Mitre, once to the Randolph, and she was quite open about things. Said she'd be willing to have sex and so on, 50 quid a time. No emotional involvement, though. She was very definite about that. You agreed? Well, I couldn't afford that sort of money, but I did ask her about coming up to my room one evening. That was just after I'd started sharing with Matthew, when he had to go home for a family funeral. But it was a Tuesday, I remember, and she said she had to be very careful which day of the week it was, because she knew somebody on the staircase. There were 2 Dons on the staircase, I understand, and Dr. McClure was one of them. You've done your homework. Go on, sir. Well, I had to go up for a civil service selection thing on November the 5th. Bonfire night in Whitehall. Whole weekend of it. Anyway, I got so pissed off with all the palaver that I didn't stay for the Sunday session. I caught the 10-something back to Oxford on the Saturday night, and when I got back to the staircase, well, there they were. We had 2 single beds, and she was in his bed and he was in mine. I don't quite know why, it just made me see red. Anyway, I went berserk, and soon we were wrestling and punching and knocking everything all over the bloody place. There was this banging on the door, and it was the stuffed prick McClure, and he wanted to know all about it, of course, who the girl was. Who was she? She called herself Ellie. Ellie Smith. And then? The senior tutor sent for me the next morning, and you know the rest. Why do you reckon you got so violent with Mr. Rodway, then?
Davies stared a while at the carpet, then answered, though without looking up.
It's as simple, really. I was in love with her.
And so was Mr. Rodway?
Davies nodded. Yeah.
Have you seen her since?
A few times.
Recently?
No.
How did your parents feel about all this?
Disappointed, naturally.
Have you told them why I'm here today?
They're on a cruise in the Aegean. I see.
Lewis stood up and closed his notebook and walked over to the window, enviously admiring the white Porsche that stood in the drive. They've left you the car, I see.
No, that's mine.
Lewis turned. I thought you... Well, you gave me the impression, sir, that £50 might be on the expensive side.
Oh, I came into some money. Rich aunt, bless her.
Lewis asked a final question as the two men stood on the front porch.
Where were you last Sunday, sir?
Oh, dear. You're not going to tell me...
What possible reason could I have?
Well, I suppose you could say it was because of Dr. McClure that they kicked me out.
Yes.
You must have hated him for that.
No, you couldn't really hate him. He was just an officious bloody bore, that's all.
Did you know that he fell in love with Ellie Smith too?
Davies sighed deeply. Yes.
Last Sunday, then? Repeated Lewis.
I went bird-watching.
On your own?
Yes.
I went out, must have been about 9:30, got back about 3. Meet anyone you knew?
No.
Did you call it a pub? Shop? Garage?
No, don't think so.
Must have been quite a lot of other bird-watchers around?
No.
It's not the best time of year for bird-watching. Too many leaves still on the trees in late summer. Unless you know a little bit about flight, song, habitat. Well, you're not going to see much, are you? Do you know anything about bird-watching, Sergeant?
No.
As Lewis left, he noticed the RSPB sticker on the rear window of the car he would have given quite a lot to drive. Perhaps not so much as £50, though. Standing quite still behind the curtained window of the first-floor front bedroom, she looked down across the drive at the departing policeman. She had a very good idea of what the interview had been about. Of course she had. Ashley Davies opened the bedroom door and walked up behind her, but she slipped away from him and picked up a small overnight grip of faded pink canvas.
I'm off.
When do I see you again?
You don't. I don't want to see you any more.
Davies sat down miserably on the side of the double bed in which they'd half-slept, the previous night. You don't love me at all, do you?
No.
Have you ever loved me?
No.
Have you ever loved anybody?
Me mum, yeah.
With a series of upward brushes, she applied some black coloration to her eyelashes. Where do you think you're going now?
Oxford.
Davies sighed miserably, stood up and reached inside his trouser pocket for his car keys.
Come on, then. I'm not going with you.
What's that supposed to mean?
I'll hitch a lift.
You can't do that.
Course I bloody can. That's all they're looking for, most of these lecherous sods. All I got to do... Ellie, first car like as not, you'll see.
In fact, Ellie Smith's prediction was unduly optimistic, since the first car drove past her with little observable sign of interest. The second car did exactly the same, but not the third. It was 1:45 on the following day, Sunday the 4th of September, when Ted and Brenda Brooks, side by side on the living-room settee, sat facing the two detectives. Morse in the only armchair there, Lewis on an upright chair imported from the kitchen. Brooks himself, in his late 40s, dressed in a white short-sleeved shirt and well-pressed grey slacks, looked pale and strained. But the skirmishing had been very civilised, and Mrs. Brooks asked if they'd like a cup of tea. Morse, however, declined, speaking, as it appeared, for all three of them. "Mr. Brooks, I know you've been in hospital, but please bear with me. We have evidence that there was some trading in drugs on your old staircase over the last 3 or 4 years."
"Nothing to do with me if there was."
"You knew nothing of it?"
"No."
"It's difficult for us, you see, because we have a statement to the effect that you did know something about it." Christ, I'd like to know who it was told you that. Load of bloody lies. You'd have no objection to coming along to HQ and going through the statement with us. I can't, not just now, I can't. I'll be happy to when I'm better. You don't want to give me another bloody heart attack, do you? Morse turned to Lewis. Sergeant? We've obviously got to interview anyone, sir, who had a link with Dr. McClure. So I shall have to ask you where you were last Sunday, the 28th of August. Last Sunday? He turned to his wife. Hear that, Bren? Not bloody difficult, that one, is it? You tell him. You remember better than I do, bloody hell. If you reckon I had anything to do with that last Sunday, Christ. Brenda Brooks folded her arms nervously in her lap, and for the first time Morse noticed that the right hand, beneath an elastic support, might be slightly deformed. Perhaps she held them to stop them shaking, but there was nothing she could do about her trembling upper lip. Well, Ted woke me about 3 o'clock that Sunday morning with this awful pain in his chest. It was a bad night. And about 6, I said we ought to ring the doctor, but Ted said not yet. Well, you know, it was Sunday, and he'd have to come out special-like. Then about 1:30, 1:45, it got so bad I rang the ambulance. He was on a machine at 2:30, about then, weren't you, Ted? It had immediately become clear to Morse that there was now a very considerable obstacle between him and any decision to arrest Edward Brooks on suspicion of murder, which would be a dramatic setback for the whole case, since Brooks's name was the only one appearing on Morse's list of suspects. He looked across at the faithful little lady sitting there in her skirt and summer blouse next to her husband. If she persisted in her present lies, for Morse was convinced that such they were, it was going to be extremely difficult to discredit her testimony, appearing as she did to possess that formidable combination of nervousness and innocence. Any jury would strongly sympathise. Morse changed tack completely. Do you know, I'm beginning to feel a bit thirsty, Mrs. Brooks. Does that offer of a cuppa still stand? After Mrs. Brooks had put the kettle on and taken the china cups from the dresser, she stood close to the kitchen door. Her hearing was still good. It was the white-haired one who was speaking. Have you got a car, sir? Not had one for 10 years or more. How do you get to work? Still go on the bus, mostly. You don't bike? Why do you ask that? I saw your cycling helmet in the hall, that's all. So? Didn't mind me asking, did you? Why the hell should I? Well, Dr. McClure was knifed to death, as you know, and there was an awful lot of blood all over the place, and all over the murderer, like as not, so if he'd driven off in a car, well, these clever lads in the lab, they can trace the tiniest speck of blood. As I said, though, I haven't got a car. I still think we'd quite like to have a look at your bike. Well, I haven't got no bike no longer, have I? Bloody stolen, wasn't it? Saturday lunchtime, week yesterday. Just went to the club for a pint, and when I get out, there it was. Gone. When 10 minutes later Mrs. Brooks was about to show them out, Morse asked about the photograph hanging on the wall of the entrance hall. That's my daughter Ellie. Her first name was Kay, really, but she likes to be called Ellie. Lewis managed not to exchange a glance with Morse. Well, what do you make of all that? The Jaguar was negotiating 6 traffic-calming humps before reaching the T-junction at the Cowley Road. Not now, Lewis. How are you feeling, sir? Just changed the first letter of my name to W. You should be in bed. Morse looked at his watch. Nearest pub, Lewis. We need to think a little. Lewis almost immediately turned left into Marsh Road, pulling up there beside the Marsh Harrier. Morse was gratified to find no music here, yet he appeared to Lewis clearly ill at ease as he started, well, almost finished really, his first swift pint of Fuller's London Pride. What's worrying you, sir? I don't know. Just got a sort of premonition about this copycat crime business. You know, a crime's reported in the press, and before you can say Anne Summers, somebody's doing the same thing. Lewis followed the drift of Morse's thought. You mean we shouldn't have placed the article in the Oxford Mail? Oh, no, it was our duty to print that, and for all we know it might still produce something, though I doubt it. Morse drained his beer before continuing. You know, that knife's somewhere, isn't it? The knife that someone stuck into McClure. That Brooks stuck into McClure. That's the infuriating thing for me, knowing that the bloody thing's somewhere, even if it's at the bottom of the canal.
I just can't see how we're going to make a case out against Brooks unless we can find the murder weapon." "You sure it was Brooks?" asked Lewis, quietly. "Too many coincidences, Lewis. All right, they play a far bigger part in life than most of us are prepared to admit, but not in this case. Just think, Brooks left Wolsey for good on exactly the same day as the man who was murdered, McClure. Not only that, the pair of them had been on the same staircase together for several years. Then, a year later, Brooks has a heart attack on exactly the same day as McClure gets murdered. Just add all that up. Go on, Lewis." "Like I say, though, you've always believed in coincidences." "Look, I could stomach 2, perhaps, but not 3.
Lewis, who'd believed that Morse could easily stomach at least 4, was not particularly impressed, and now, looking round him, he saw that he and Morse were the only customers left in the Marsh Harrier. It was 3:10 p.m. "We'd better be off, sir." "Nonsense! My turn, isn't it?" But the landlord, after explaining that serving further drinks after 3 p.m. was wholly against the law, was distinctly unimpressed by Morse's assertion that he was the law, and a minute or so later it was a slightly embarrassed Lewis who was unlocking the passenger door of the Jaguar before making his way back to North Oxford. Perpetually on the drive back, Morse had been wiping the perspiration from his forehead, and Lewis was growing increasingly worried, especially when once back home Morse immediately poured himself a can of beer. "Well, talk to me. Tell me what you thought about Brooks." "No, sir. You're the thinker. That's why you get a bigger pay packet than me. You tell me." "Well, I think exactly the same as I did before. After young Rodway's suicide, McClure found out about the availability of drugs on the staircase there, and he also found out that it was Brooks who was supplying them. Then at some point McClure confronted Brooks, and Brooks resigned. I hadn't got another job with a reluctant McClure providing a lukewarm testimonial to the Pitt Rivers Museum. But Brooks kept up the lucrative little sideline after he'd left Wolsey, until McClure somehow got wind of the situation and confronted him again. Brooks arranged a meeting with McClure at McClure's place in Daventry Court a week ago today. That's the way I see it." "Well, you think he biked up to see McClure?" "He biked, yes. Whether he'd already decided to murder McClure then, I don't know. But he took a murder weapon with him, a knife from his wife's kitchen drawer. And I've not the slightest doubt he took as many precautions as he could to keep himself from being recognised. Probably wrapped a scarf around his face, as if he'd got toothache. And with his cycling helmet." "You're making it all up, sir." Morse wiped his brow once more.
"Of course I am. In a case like this, you've got to put up some scaffolding, Lewis. You've got to hypothesise."
"Hypothesise about the knife, then, sir."
"He threw it in the canal. So we're not going to find it." "I'm sure we're not."
"He could have taken it home with him, washed it up and put it back in the kitchen drawer."
"Yes."
"What about the bike, though?"
Morse shook his head. "He must have ditched it somewhere."
Morse now coughed violently, expectorating into a tissue a disgusting gobbet of yellowish-green phlegm streaked with bright blood. Lewis, although he saw it, said nothing, and Morse continued,
"First thing is to get Brooks in,
and go through Susan Ewer's statement with him.
She's a good witness, that one, and he'll have to come up with something better than he gave us this afternoon."
"When shall we bring him in, though? He's got a point, hasn't he? We don't want to give him another heart attack."
"Don't we?"
"Day or 2?
"Day or 3.
Morse was coughing uncontrollably now, finally disappearing into the bathroom, whence was heard a series of revolting retches. Lewis walked out into the entrance hall, where he flicked open Morse's black plastic telephone index to the letter S. He was lucky. Under Summertown Health Centre he found an appointments number and an emergency number. He rang the latter. That same afternoon, just after 4 o'clock, Dr. Richard Rayson, Fellow of Trinity College, strolled around his garden in Daventry Avenue. For almost 3 weeks he'd been away with his family in the Dolomites. He'd spotted the knife almost immediately, a couple of feet or so inside the property, lying next to a semi-squashed tin of Coca-Cola. Nina Rayson had welcomed her husband's discovery, promptly washing it and forthwith adding it to her own canteen of cutlery. A good knife it was, a fairly new, sturdy, unusually broad-bladed instrument, in no immediate need of any further sharpening. That same evening, at 9:30, Brenda Brooks was aware that her jangled nerves could stand very little more that day. Paradoxically, though,
she felt almost competent about coping with the loathsome man she'd just seen to bed with a cup of tea, 2 digestive biscuits, and 1 sleeping tablet. At least she knew him, knew the worst about him, for there was nothing but the worst to know. It was now the unknown that was worrying her more deeply. She found herself neurotically dreading any phone call, any ringing of the doorbell, anything. What was that? Was she imagining things? Imagining noises? There it was again, a muffled, insistent, insidious tapping. Fearfully she edged towards the front door. And there, behind the frosted glass, she saw a vaguely human silhouette, and she turned the Yale lock and opened the door, her heart fluttering nervously. "You," she whispered.
Oxford's St Giles Fair is held annually on the first Monday and Tuesday after the first Sunday every September, with the whole area of St Giles brought into use. In mid-afternoon on Tuesday the 6th of September, 2 days after Lewis had telephoned the Summertown Health Centre, Kevin Costin was sauntering under the plane trees there, along the various rides and amusements and candy floss stalls. No more school, but no job yet either. Not that he was interested in jobs, just money. Well, not just money, no. Smugly, he grinned to himself as he stood outside the Bird and Baby and watched the gigantic gyrating structure of the big wheel. The previous month, he'd been part of a 3-man ram raid at a Summertown supermarket, but it hadn't proved the windfall they'd expected. There must be easier ways of being able to afford the life of Riley, surely. Yes, occasionally there were. It had been Kevin Costin himself who'd answered the door the previous afternoon to find Mrs. Stevens standing there, a subtly scented Mrs. Stevens, with a moist, red beauty at her lips. Could she come in? She'd come in. Would he listen to what she had to say? He'd listen. Would he be willing to do as she asked? He'd be willing. Would he be able to do what she wanted? He'd be able. Payment? What about payment? Did he understand that she had very little money? He'd understood. How would he like her to pay him then? Well... What time's your mother back? She'd asked. Half now, half later. That's what Mrs. Stevens had promised. When the jobs were done. On Wednesday the 7th of September at 11:20 a.m, Miss Ellie Smith sat in a taxi, every half-minute or so nervously consulting her watch. What with the combination of a signalling failure just before Leamington Spa and a security scare at Coventry, the train had finally rumbled into Birmingham New Street 48 minutes late, and she had no option but to take a taxi. Not that she need have bothered too much, for it was 11:55 a.m. before she was called into the consulting room. Looking back on things, Miss Smith knew that she had been strangely impressed by the small, white-coated Pakistani doctor who had gently encouraged her to consider keeping the child she had conceived. She felt glad that she had put on a bra and pants beneath her only presentable summer dress and removed the rings from her nostrils. She felt, dare she admit it to herself, somehow expiated. It was something to do with being with her mum once more. The 15:09 train from New Street, timetabled to arrive in Oxford at 16:31, arrived virtually on time, and half an hour later Ellie Smith was back at her flat, reading the brief note contained in the white envelope which she'd found propped up at the foot of her door on the 3rd floor. Hope things went okay. Any chance of you thinking again? If there was even a remote chance of its being mine, I'll marry you and make an honest woman of you yet. Don't be cross with me for badgering you. Ashley, with lots and lots of kisses. As she put her key into the lock, Ellie Smith wondered if she'd sadly misjudged Mr. Ashley Davies. Although the autumn term had only begun the day before, clearly 1 or 2 of the local schools had been planning well in advance to dispatch their pupils on some of the dreaded GCSE projects at the earliest possible opportunity. Certainly until about 4:05 p.m, 20 or so school children had still been studying a range of anthropological exhibits in the upper gallery of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which was rather worrying. But by 4:20 the galleries were totally deserted, and from where he stood, beside the collection made in the South Pacific by Captain Cook in 1772, the young man observed most carefully. A sun-tanned, balding attendant walked briskly around the upper gallery, giving a quick upward lift to each of the glass covers of the locked cabinets there. 2 minutes later, the young man was following in the attendant's tracks, but stopping now at a particular spot where he looked down at a collection of knives. Knives of all shapes and sizes, knives from many parts of the world, displayed in cabinet number 52. His heart pounding, he took a chisel from his sweatshirt. Just a single quick click. The young man checked anxiously to his left, then to his right, before lifting the glass lid and putting a hand inside. It was 4:29 when he walked through the museum shop. An assistant was already totting up the takings. As the prominent notice had advised him as he'd entered, the Pitt Rivers Museum closed at 4:30 each day. At the Proctor Memorial School, the take-up for the 12th night trip to the Shakespeare Theatre had been encouraging. Julia Stevens had invited Brenda Brooks, as she'd done the previous year, to join the school party, and on the way back they sat side by side in the front seats. Julia listening with some gratification to her pupils' pronouncements, and Brenda until Woodstock trying to read Woman's Weekly, before apparently falling into a deep slumber, and not awakening until about 2 minutes to midnight on Wednesday the 7th of September. The coach made its first stop at Carfax Tower, from where the streets of Oxford looked strangely beautiful and slightly sinister. After ringing the emergency number the previous Sunday, it had been a sad sight that had confronted Lewis in the bathroom. Morse, standing creased over the pedestal basin, his cheeks wholly drained of colour, his vomit streaked with blood forming a chrysanthemum pattern, scarlet on white, across the porcelain. Dr. Paul Roblin had been adamant. Ambulance. And in spite of his every protestation of being in good health, Morse had been conveyed to the John Radcliffe II Hospital out at Headington. Lewis had woken up to the truth an hour or so later. For a while at least, it was he who was sole arbiter of the course of further inquiries. Over the following Monday and Tuesday, the 5th and 6th of September, many statements were taken, and Lewis's queries were concluded late that Tuesday afternoon, with the knowledge that he was getting nowhere, fairly slowly. Yet only 24 hours were to elapse before the first major breakthrough. Dr. Richard Rayson had been wholly unaware of the great excitement which had been witnessed by the residents of Daventry Avenue over the previous week. The physical police presence had been withdrawn on the day prior to his return from abroad. Thus, having spent the whole of Monday and Tuesday with his wife regrooming their garden, it was only at lunchtime on Wednesday that Rayson was reintroduced into the mainstream of Oxford life and gossip at a cocktail reception in Trinity College to meet a group of librarians from Oklahoma. "By the way, you must have known old McClure, I suppose?" Rayson had frowned. "McClure? You know, the poor sod who got himself knifed." "McClure? Felix McClure knifed?" The knife! Just after 5 o'clock that afternoon, Lewis stood looking down at the prime exhibit, laid out on the formica-topped surface of the kitchen in Rayson's elegant detached house in Daventry Avenue, 7 properties distant, on the Woodstock roadside, from the scene of McClure's murder. Several thoughts coursed through Lewis's mind, exciting thoughts. There was the firm likelihood that the second of Morse's necessary prerequisites had now been met. Not only a body, but also a weapon. And this one surely seemed to fit the bill so very nicely. And, by far the most exciting thought, there was the strong possibility that the knife had come from a set, one of which Lewis had seen so very recently, that slim, elegant, black-handled little knife with which Mrs. Brenda Brooks had sliced the Madeira cake the previous Sunday. After being diagnosed with an unpronounceable bronchial condition and warned about everything from disintegrating kidneys and incipient diabetes, Morse had been placed under observation and was due to be discharged at 10 o'clock on the morning of Thursday, September the 8th. Lewis had rung through to the ward sister half an hour earlier to save Morse any wait for an ambulance and to chauffeur him home in style, only to discover that his chief had already discharged himself, getting a lift from one of the consultants there who was on his way out to Bicester. Lewis rang the doorbell at 9:45 a.m. Morse, his cheeks rosy red, appeared on the threshold, panting like a breathless bulldog. "I'm just starting a new regimen, Lewis. No more nicotine, limited alcohol, plenty of fresh fruit and salad,
And regular exercise. I've just done a dozen press-ups. You must be feeling quite elated, sir. Knackered is the word I think you're looking for, Lewis. Come in. Good to see you. Have a drink. No, nothing for me, thanks. I'll just... Morse quickly drained a tumbler of some pale amber liquid. A small celebratory libation, that, Lewis. In gratitude to whatever gods there be that temporarily I've survived the perils and dangers of this mortal life. Lewis managed a grin, half sad, half happy, and immediately told Morse about the knife. For a while, Morse sat in silence. Then he jumped to his feet, and against all the medical advice he'd so meekly accepted over the previous few days, insisted on being driven immediately to Police HQ, stopping only briefly to buy a packet of Dunhill king-size cigarettes. Brenda Brooks had spent the previous night in the spare bedroom of Julius Stevens' house. After Mrs. Stevens had left for school, Brenda had eaten a bowl of cornflakes and a round of toast and marmalade. Her appointment at the hairdresser's was for 9:15, and well over an hour and a half later, as she turned into Addison Road, she immediately spotted the elegant-looking maroon Jaguar and the two men she'd seen the previous Sunday afternoon. "If it's Ted you want, he's up at the JR2. He's got an outpatient appointment." The fingers of her left hand were plucking their way along the invisible rosary she kept in her right. "You'd better come in, hadn't you?" Haltingly, as they sat again in the lounge, Mrs. Brooks sought to explain the situation. "You haven't been in this house since when?" asked Morse, rather too brusquely. "At 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, or just before. The coach for Stratford left at 5. Lewis sounded a kindlier note. "Did you enjoy the play? What was it, by the way?" "Twelfth Night. I loved it, yes." "And you went with a friend, you say?" "Yes." Lewis was noting the name and address when the telephone rang. Mrs. Brooks went to the hall. As she did so, Morse immediately pointed in the opposite direction, and Lewis stepped quietly into the kitchen, where he opened a drawer by the side of the sink. Brenda Brooks, her face anxious, walked back into the lounge, only a few seconds after Lewis, with a silent thumbs-up sign, had reappeared from the kitchen and quickly resumed his seat. "Anything important?" asked Morse. "It was the hospital. Ted's not been there, not yet. So the lady at appointments says. He was due there at 9:20, it seems." "What do you think's happened to him?" asked Morse quietly. "Well, that's what she asked me. I don't know." It seemed to Morse no great surprise that Mr. Edward Brooks had decided to make a bolt for it, once news of the discovery of that fatal knife had leaked out. Which it hadn't. Lewis had seen to that. The details of what was to prove the key discovery in the case, or to be more exact, the lack of key discovery in the case, were not communicated by the City Police to Kidlington HQ until just after 1 p.m. that same day, although the discovery had been made as early as 8:45 a.m. by a cleaner at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Paradoxically, Jane Cottrell, administrator of the museum, was attending a meeting that morning at the Ashmolean on museum security, but she was summoned to the telephone and was soon issuing her orders. In retrospect, the linkage appeared to be so very obvious. Yet someone had to make it first, that someone being Jane Cottrell. The linkage between the earlier visit of the police, the museum's employment of Edward Brooks, the murder by knifing of Dr. McClure, and now the theft of another knife from one of the museum's cabinets. Thus, it was Jane Cottrell herself who'd argued that the City Police should link their inquiry into the theft with the Kidlington inquiry into the murder of McClure, and Jane Cottrell herself who'd greeted Morse and Lewis in the Pitt Rivers Upper Gallery at 2 p.m. "It's what I was afraid of. Though God knows why," mumbled Morse to himself as he looked down at Cabinet 52, now dusted liberally with fingerprint powder. 10 minutes later, while Lewis was taking a statement from the cleaner who had discovered the broken cabinet, Morse was seated opposite the administrator, quickly realising that he was unlikely to learn, at least from her, more than two fairly simple facts. First, that almost certainly the cabinet had been forced between 4:15 and 4:30 the previous afternoon. Second, since the contents of the cabinet had been fully documented only 6 months earlier, when exhibits had been rearranged and cabinets relined, it could be stated quite authoritatively that one artefact, and one only, an African knife, had been abstracted. Yet Morse seemed uneasy.
Could one of your own staff have pinched it?
Good Lord, no. Why should any of them want to do that? Most of them have access to the key cupboard anyway.
I see.
Morse nodded vaguely and stood up.
By the way, what do you line your cabinets with? Some sort of new-style Hessian. Supposed to keep its colour for yonks, so the advert said. Morse smiled, suddenly feeling close to her. Can I say something? I'd never have expected you to say yonks. She smiled back at him shyly. You wouldn't? It seemed a good moment for one of them to elaborate on this intimate turn of the conversation, but neither did so, and Morse reverted to his earlier line of inquiry. You don't think anyone could have hidden himself after closing time and spent the night here in the museum? No, the place is positively bristling with burglar alarms. And anyway, it'd be far too spooky, surely. I couldn't do it. Could you? No. I've always been frightened of the dark myself, admitted Morse. It's a bit eerie, this place, even in broad daylight. Yes, she said softly. When you come in here, you enter a place where all the lovely myths go when they die. Suddenly Morse felt very moved. After he'd left her office, Jane felt guilty about not telling him that the myths bit was far from original, and indeed she'd looked around to try and find him to tell him so. But he'd left. Now Julia Stevens was very fair to behold, for there was a gentle beauty in the pallor of the skin beneath that Titian hair, and the softest invitation in the redness of her lips, and as he sat opposite her that evening, Morse was immediately made aware of an animal magnetism. Care for a drink, Inspector? No, thank you. Does that mean yes? Yes. Scotch? Why not? Mind if I smoke? Yes, I do. She left the room and returned with an ashtray. Perhaps they were beginning to understand each other. Mrs. Brooks stayed the night here, began Morse. Yes. You see, her husband's gone missing. He failed to keep an appointment at the hospital this morning. I know. Brenda rang me. Have you any idea where he might be? No, but I hope somebody's stuck a knife into him somewhere. As he looked across at the schoolmistress, Morse found himself wondering whether her pale complexion was due to some illness, for he'd observed, in a face almost completely devoid of any other cosmetic device, some skin-tinted application to the darkened rings beneath her eyes. Did Mrs. Brooks go out last night, after you'd got back? Julia smiled tolerantly. You mean, did she just nip out for a few minutes and bump him off? Could she have gone out? That's all I'm asking. Look, the only thing I know for certain is that she was fast asleep when I took her a cup of tea just before 7 this morning. So she'd been with you the whole time since yesterday afternoon? Since about 4:45, yes. I would have picked her up in the car, but the wretched thing wanted to stay at home in the garage. Electrical trouble. You should get a car like mine. I've got a pre-electrics model. Julia smiled politely. We took a bus up to school, and, well, that's about it, really. Did you actually go into the Brooks' house? Did you speak to Brooks? You mean ask him politely if he was feeling better? You must be joking. Did his wife speak to him? Yes. She said goodbye. She didn't say cheerio or see you soon. No, she said goodbye. What about you? Did you go out last night? Do you suspect me as well? Suspect you of what, Mrs. Stevens? Julia's clear grey eyes sparkled almost gleefully. Well, if somebody's bumped off old Brooks. You look as if you hope someone has. Didn't I make that clear from the start, Inspector? Have you actually seen Mrs. Brooks since you left home this morning? No, I've been at school all day. For a little while each was silent, Morse looking around the neatly cluttered room. He saw on the settee beside Julia a copy of Ernest Dowson's poems. You enjoy Dowson? You've heard of him. They are not long, the weeping and the laughter, love and desire and hate. I'm impressed. Can you go on? Oh, yes, said Morse quietly. For some reason, and for the first time that evening, Julia Stevens betrayed some sign of discomfiture, and Morse saw, perhaps he saw, a film of tears across her eyes. Anything else I can do for you, Inspector? Yes, you can take me to bed with you.
I may feel no love for you, perhaps, but I perceive the beauty and the readiness of this moment, and soon there will be no beauty and no readiness."
"No! I think that's all," he said. The phone rang as they walked into the narrow hallway, and Julia quickly picked up the receiver. "Oh, hello. Look, I'll ring you back in 5 minutes. Just give me the number, will you?" She wrote down 5 digits on the small yellow pad beside the phone and said, "Bye," as did a male voice at the other end of the line, if Morse had heard aright. As they took leave of each other at the doorway, it seemed for a moment that they might have embraced, however perfunctorily, but they did not. It might have been possible, too, for Morse to have spotted the true importance of what Julia Stevens had told him, but he did not. "Ain't you got any decent music in this car?" she asked, as Lewis drove down the Iffley Road towards Magdalen Bridge. "That's your Mozart, that is. I keep getting told to educate my musical tastes. It's a bit miserable, isn't it?" "Don't you go saying that to my boss. Who's he when he's at home?" "Chief Inspector Morse. Chap you're going to see. You're getting the VIP treatment this morning." "Don't you think I'm used to that, Sergeant?" She leaned back languorously, and even to the staid Lewis, as he made his way up to Kidlington, she seemed to exude a powerful sexuality. He wondered what Morse would make of Miss Eleanor Smith. The answer appeared to be not very much, for the interview was strangely low-key, with Morse leaving everything to Lewis. Miss Smith had had nothing to do with the murder of poor Dr. McClure, of course, and she was confident she could produce witnesses to account for her activities that Sunday. 35 of them, in fact, including the coach driver. Yes, she'd known Matthew Rodway and liked him. Yes, she'd known, still knew, Ashley Davies and liked him as well. Last Wednesday, where'd she been then? Well, if they must know, in Birmingham most of the day on a personal matter. Back in Oxford Station at about 4:30, the train, surprise, surprise, had been on time. And then, Lewis had persisted, she'd invited one of her girlfriends up to the bedsit. They'd drunk a bottle of far-from vintage champers, and this muted celebration, the occasion for which Eleanor failed to specify, was followed by a somewhat louder merrymaking at the local pub, whence she'd been escorted home at closing time. Morse and Lewis had exchanged glances. If she were telling the truth, it was not this woman, not McClure's former mistress, not Brooks's stepdaughter who had stolen the knife from Cabinet 52, or done anything with it afterwards. And after another glance from Morse, Lewis told her of the theft from the Pitt Rivers. Told her, too, of the disappearance of her stepfather. Ah, her stepfather. Well, that wasn't going to cause her too much grief, was it? She just hoped they'd find him lying in a gutter somewhere with a knife. That knife stuck firmly in his bloody guts. The chief inspector had not spoken a single word, and the truth was that, like some maverick magnet, he'd felt half repelled, half attracted by the strange creature seated there, with her lack of respect for police procedure and a contempt for the well-being of her stepfather, Mr. Edward Brooks. A note had been brought into the room a few minutes earlier and handed to Morse, and now, with the interview apparently nearing its end, Morse jerked his head towards the door and led the way into the corridor. The press had got wind of the Pitt Rivers business, and questions were being asked about a possible linkage with the murder inquiry. Lewis had better go and mollify the media, and not worry too much about concealing any confidential information, which shouldn't be terribly difficult, since there was no confidential information. He himself, Morse, would see that Miss Smith was escorted safely home. She spoke as Morse came up to the first roundabout on his way towards Oxford. "Your sergeant said you was trying to educate his musical tastes." "Did he?" "You don't think I need a bit of educating?" Morse hesitated before answering her. "I'll tell you what your trouble is, shall I? You're suffering from a form of inverted snobbery, that's all. Not unusual, you know, in girls, in young ladies like you. If that's supposed to be a bloody insult, mister, you couldn't have done much bleeding better, could you? I'm only guessing, don't be cross. I don't know you at all, do I? We've never even spoken. Except on the phone, remember?" Morse almost managed a weak smile as he waited at the busy Cutterslow roundabout. "I remember. Great, that was. You know, pretending to be somebody else. I sometimes think I should have been an actress." "You are an actress."
That's exactly what I'm saying. Well, I'll tell you something. Right at this minute, there's one thing I'd swap even for an Oscar.
What's that?
Plate of steak and chips. I'm starving.
Do you know how much steak costs these days?
Yeah? It's $3.99 at the King's Arms just down the road here. Salad and chips chucked in. I saw it on the way up.
Don't you ever eat? Demanded Ellie, wiping her mouth on the sleeve of her blouse and draining her third glass of red wine. Not very often at mealtimes, no. But don't worry, I'm the only person in Oxford who gets more sober the more he drinks. Do you know when you've had enough?
Not always.
You had enough now?
Nearly.
Can I buy you one?
19 times out of 20.
But I've got to drive you home and then get back to give Sergeant Lewis his next music lesson.
What's all them weasel words supposed to mean?
Pint of best bitter, said Morse, if you insist.
Would you ever think of giving me a music lesson? She asked, as the Jaguar made its way over the Magdalen Bridge.
No.
Why not?
You want me to be honest?
Why not? I just couldn't stick looking at those rings in your nose. She felt the insult like a slap across the face, and had the car still been queuing at the Longwall lights, she would have jumped out and left him. But they were travelling now quite quickly up the Iffley Road, and by the time they reached Princess Street, she was feeling fractionally less furious, and she glanced across at Morse in a slightly new light. In the pub, as she'd noticed, he'd averted his gaze from her for much of the time, and now, she knew why, he was a bit different. A lot different, really, from the rest of them his age, anyway. What the hell, though? Bloody police. Look, if you want to check up about Wednesday when I went to Brum, I went to an abortion clinic there. But I decided I wasn't going to go through with it, okay? Then about last night, your sergeant couldn't reach me, right? Well, I went out with Ashley Davies, and he asked me to marry him. With or without me bloody nose rings, mister, okay?
With that, she opened the near side door and jumped out. She slammed it so hard that for a moment Morse wondered if some damage might have been incurred by the Jaguar's pre-electrics locking mechanism.
And you can stuff your fucking Mozart, okay? That night, Morse had a vivid dream. He was playing a saxophone in a jazz ensemble, ever worried whence he'd acquired such dazzling virtuosity, and ever worried that his skill would desert him in front of his adulatory audience, amongst whom he'd spotted a girl with 2 rings in her nose, a girl who could never be Eleanor Smith, though, since the girl in the dream was disfigured and ugly, and Eleanor Smith could never be that. At 1 a.m. that same night, still dressed, Kevin Costin was sitting on his bed. Surprisingly, in a week of virtually unparalleled excitement, his thoughts were centred soberly on his surroundings. The litter-strewn front gardens along the road, the shoddy, undusted house in which he lived with his feckless mother. Above all, the sordid state of his own bedroom, and particularly of the soiled, creased sheets in which he'd slept for the past 7 weeks or more. It was the contrast that had caught his imagination. Between all this and the polished, clean, sweet-smelling rooms in Mrs. Stevens' house. Above all, the snow-white, crisply laundered sheets on her inviting bed. He thought he'd always known what makes the difference in life. Money. And as he took his socks and trousers off and got into bed, he found himself wondering how much money Mrs. Stevens might have saved in life. Restless too that night was the scout, now given responsibility for Staircase G in the Drinkwater Quad at Woolsey. At 2 a.m. she went downstairs to make herself a cup of tea. Susan had agreed to check and sign, at 10 o'clock the following morning, Saturday, the statement earlier made to Sergeant Lewis, and the prospect worried her. She feared she would now be open to some sort of retaliation, to threats of physical violence perhaps, from a man who, by almost unanimous verdict, was seen as a very nasty piece of work indeed. A week in a murder inquiry, especially one in which there is virtually no development, can be a wearisome time. And so it was for Sergeant Lewis in the days between Friday the 9th and Friday the 16th of September. The whereabouts and movements of key characters in the Pitt Rivers inquiry, most particularly on the evening and night of Wednesday the 7th, immediately after the knife had been stolen, had been checked and in every case confirmed with statements duly signed and filed. Nothing else, though.
Morse, too, was finding this period of inactivity frustrating, and a time of considerable stress, since for 3 whole days now he had not smoked a single cigarette, and had arrived at that crucial point where his self-mastery had already been demonstrated, his victory over nicotine finally won. So it was no longer a question of relapsing, of re-indulging. If he wished to restart, though, for in truth the 4th day was proving even harder than the 3rd. The earlier wave of euphoria was ebbing still further on the 5th day, when he checked in at outpatient's reception at the JR2 for a check-up, scheduled for 9:20 a.m. After a fairly thorough examination, Morse was out again into the morning sunshine, with a new date, 6 whole weeks away, written into his little blue card, and with the look of a man who feels a fresh confidence in life. What was it the doc had said? "You know, I'm not quite sure why, but you're over things pretty well. You don't deserve to be, Mr. Morse, but, well, you seem surprisingly fit to me." Walking along to the southern car park, and savouring still the happy tidings, Morse caught sight of a young woman standing at the bus stop. "Good morning, Miss Smith," said the cheerful Chief Inspector. "Can I give you a lift somewhere?" Little that morning could have dampened Morse's spirits, for the gods were surely smiling on him. Even had she ignored his greeting, he would have walked serenely past with little sense of personal slight. Yet perhaps he would have felt a touch of disappointment too, for he'd seen the sadness in her face, and knew for a little while he wanted to be with her. "Want to tell me about it? Why the hell should I tell you?" Morse breathed in deeply as she stubbed out her cigarette with venom. "I think you've been in hospital overnight. I could see a bit of white nighty peeping out of the hold-all. The last time we met you told me you were expecting a baby," he added gently. "I only asked if you wanted to tell me about it." "I lost it," she said finally. "I'm sorry," he said, not speaking again until he reached Princess Street. She got out of the car and picked up her hold-all from the back. "Thank you. I wasn't much help, I'm afraid. But if I can ever be of help, you've only got to give me a ring." He wrote down his ex-directory telephone number. "Well, you could help me now, actually. It's a lousy little place I live in, but I'd be quite glad if you'd come in and have a drink with me." "Not this morning." "Why the hell not, for Christ's sake? You just said to give you a ring if I needed help, and I bloody do, okay? Now!" "All right, I'll come in and have one quick drink. On one condition, though." "What's that?" "You don't slam the car door. Agreed?" "Doesn't seem too lousy a little place," suggested Morse, as whiskey in hand he leaned back in the only armchair. "Cigarette?" Ellie held out the packet, and stupidly, inevitably, Morse capitulated. "You're still going ahead with getting married?" "Why not? About time I settled down, don't you think?" "I suppose so." "What else can I tell you?" Well, if she was inviting questions, Morse decided, it was a good opportunity to probe a little deeper into the heart of the mystery, since he was convinced that the key to the case, the key to both cases, lay somewhere in those late afternoon hours of Wednesday, the 7th of September, when someone had stolen the knife from the Pitt Rivers Museum. "On that Wednesday—" But she let him get no further. "Christ, give it a rest about Wednesday, will you? What's wrong with Tuesday? Or Monday? I haven't a bleeding clue what I was doing them days. So why Wednesday? Like I say, I know where I was all the bloody time that day." "It's just that there may be a connection between McClure's murder and the theft of the knife." She seemed unimpressed. Morse rose to his feet and put his glass down on the cluttered mantelpiece. He turned towards her, looking down at her as she sat on the side of the bed. "Why did you invite me in here?" "I only ask because you're making me feel like an intruder." She looked down into her glass. "I felt lonely, that's all. I wanted a bit of company." "Haven't you told Mr. Davies about your miscarriage?" "No." "Don't you think—" "Oh, shut up. You wouldn't know what it feels like, would you, to be on your own in life?" "I'm on my own all the time," said Morse. "That's what they all say. All them middle-aged fellas like you." Morse nodded and half smiled. Leaving her still seated on the bed, he trod down the narrow, squeaking staircase to the Jaguar, where for a few minutes he sat motionless, with the old familiar sensation tingling across his shoulders. Why hadn't he thought of it before? Lewis was eager to pass on his news. Morse, however, on his rather late return from lunch, was to give Lewis no immediate opportunity of reporting his potentially glad tidings. "I saw Miss Smith this morning. She'd been in the JR1 overnight." "All right, is she?" "I don't know about that. She gave me an idea, though." Morse stripped the cellophane from a packet of cigarettes, took one out and lit it. "As you know, I felt pretty certain almost from the beginning that McClure was murdered by Brooks. And I think now, though I can't be certain, of course, that Brooks himself was murdered last week. And I know, listen, Lewis, I now know what Brooks's murderer wanted us to think." Lewis looked at the Chief Inspector and saw that not uncommon, strangely distanced, almost mystical look in the gentian blue eyes. "You see, Brooks's body is somewhere where we'll never find it. I feel oddly sure about that. But consider the consequences of that being so. We all jumped to the same conclusion, that there was a direct link between the murder of Brooks and the theft of the knife. Now, there was a grand deception here. That theft was a great big bluff. For what purpose? To convince us that Brooks was murdered after 4:30 p.m. on that Wednesday the 7th. But he wasn't. He was murdered the day before. He was murdered on Tuesday the 6th. "But he was seen alive on the Wednesday, sir. His wife saw him. Mrs. Stevens saw him." "Liars, both of them." "You mean they murdered Brooks?" "That's exactly what I do mean, yes. It must have been Julia Stevens who supplied the brains, who somehow arranged the business with the knife. But what, Lewis, if Brooks was murdered by another knife? A household knife, let's say, a knife just like the one McClure was murdered with, the knife that was found in Daventry Avenue, the knife that went missing from the Brooks' kitchen." Lewis shook his head slowly. "Why all this palaver, though?" "Good question. So I'll give you a good answer. To give the murderers, watertight alibis for that Wednesday. I suddenly knew it this morning when I was interviewing our punk wonder." "Well, she's in it too, you reckon?" Morse nodded. "All three of them have been telling us the same thing, really. Look, I don't mind being suspected of doing something on Tuesday, but not on the Wednesday. You see, they all knew they'd be likely suspects, and they've been very gently, very cleverly, pushing us all along in the direction they wanted." "Well, all three of them, you think?" "Yes. They'd all have gladly murdered Brooks, even if they hadn't known he was a murderer himself. So they hatch a plot. They arrange for the knife to be stolen, having made sure that none of them could have stolen it." "Well, Ellie Smith could have stolen it," interposed Lewis quietly. "Yes, perhaps she could, yes, but I don't think so. No. My guess is that they bribed someone to steal it. Someone one of them could trust." "Ashley Davies?" "Why not? He's got his reward, hasn't he?" "You think that's a reward, sir? Marrying her?" Morse was silent a while. "Do you know, Lewis? It might be." "What did they do with the knife?" "Well, that's the whole point. That's what I'm telling you. They didn't use the stolen knife at all. They just got rid of it." "You seem to be assuming an awful lot of brains somewhere." "Look, Lewis, there seems to be a myth going around these days that criminals are a load of morons, and that CID personnel are all members of Mensa." "Perhaps I should apply then," said Lewis slowly. "Pardon?" "Well, I've been very clever, sir, while you were away. I think I've found Brooks's bike." "You have? Why the hell didn't you tell me before?" At the Proctor Memorial School that Friday afternoon, the talk was predominantly of a ram raid made by 3 youths on an off-licence in the Blackbird Leys estate the previous evening. The stolen getaway car had crashed at full speed into a lorry near the Horspath roundabout on the Eastern Ring Road. The considerable interest in this incident is readily explicable, since the 2 youths who survived the crash had spent 5 years at the Proctor Memorial School, and the former pupil who had been seated in the back of the car had left his alma mater only the previous term. His name was Kevin Costin. In the major trauma ward on level 5 of the JR2 in Headington, Julia Stevens explained to the ward's sister that she had rung an hour earlier and been told that it would be all right for her to visit Mr. Kevin Costin. "How is he?" "Oh, probably not quite as bad as he looks, but we're a little worried about his brain, yes." He was awake and recognised her immediately. "I'm sorry,"
he whispered, speaking through a dreadfully lopsided mouth. Shh. I've just come to see how you're getting on, that's all. I'm sorry. Listen, I'm the teacher, remember? Just let me do the talking. That were the worst thing I ever done in my life. Don't talk about it now. You weren't driving. He turned his face towards her, revealing the left cheek so terribly bloodied and stitched and torn. It's not that, Mrs. Stevens. It's when I asked you for the money. I should never have done that. You're the only person that was ever good to me, really. And then I go and... His words were faltering, and there was a film of tears across his eyes. Don't worry about that, Kevin. I won't ever tell anybody what I done for you. Honest to God, I won't. A few minutes later, as she waited for the lift down to the ground floor, Julia smiled sadly to herself as she recalled the nurse's words. We're a little worried about his brain. Just like almost all the staff at the Proctor Memorial School had been for 5 years. And then, as she tried to remember exactly where she'd parked the Volvo, she found herself for some reason thinking of Chief Inspector Morse. Of the 4 separate operas which comprised Der Ring der Nibelungen, an achievement which in his view ranked as one of the 7 great wonders of the modern world, Siegfried had always been Morse's least favourite. And on the evening of Saturday the 17th of September, he decided he would seek again to discover whether the fault lay with himself or Wagner. But the evening was destined not to pass without interruption. 40 minutes into Siegfried, the telephone rang. Hello? Chief Inspector Morse? It was a woman's voice, and Morse knew whose. Yes? Hi. You told me if I ever wanted any help, all I got to do was pick up the phone, remember? How can I help? Asked Morse, a hint of exasperation in his voice. You don't sound overjoyed to hear from me. Just a bit tired, that's all. Too tired for me to treat you to a pint? I'm sorry, I'm in the bath. Wiggle the water a bit so I can hear. I can't, I'd get the phone wet. So you didn't really mean what you said at all? Yes, I did. I'll be only too glad to help. What's the trouble? It's no good, not over the phone. Why on earth not? You'll see. I don't follow you. I'm just going out to the old parsonage for a drink. I'll stay there half an hour. If you've not turned up by then, I'll just take a taxi up to your place. Okay with you? Morse looked at his watch. Almost 8:30. Give me half an hour, he said, wondering where his wallet was, for he seldom used it when Lewis was around. Lewis also rang that evening, about 10 minutes after Morse had left. The Path Lab had confirmed that blood found on the recovered bicycle was McClure's, and on his way home, a little disappointed, Lewis pushed a note to that effect through the front door of Morse's bachelor flat. She was nowhere to be seen in the parsonage bar. There were, however, 2 temporarily unescorted young women there, one blonde, the other brunette. With no real ale on offer, Morse ordered a glass of claret and sat on one of the green bar stools watching the main door. But Miss Smith made no entrance. You on your own? The exaggeratedly seductive voice had come from directly behind him, and Morse swiveled to find one of the 2 women, the brunette, climbing somewhat inelegantly onto the adjoining bar stool. For the moment I am, yes. Can I buy... He'd been looking at her hair, a rich dark brown with bottled auburn highlights, but now he was looking into her eyes that were sludgy green like the waters of the Oxford Canal. Ye gods, he exclaimed. Didn't recognise me, did you? What will you have to drink? I fancy some champagne. She smiled at him slyly. You look a little shell-shocked, Inspector. In fact, Morse was beginning to feel annoyed at the way she was mocking him. He'd show her. Bottle of number 19, waiter. They sat opposite each other at one of the small circular top tables. You can't blame me for not recognising you. You look completely different. Why this change of heart? She shook her head. Just change of appearance. You can't change your heart. Didn't you know that? You know what I mean, said Morse defensively. Well, like I told you, I'm getting spliced. Got to be a respectable girl now. How can I help you? Well, I thought you might like to see me for starters. That wouldn't have been no good over the blower, would it? Why do you have to keep talking in that sort of way? You've got a pleasant voice and you can speak very nicely, but sometimes you deliberately try to sound like a trollop. Yes. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then it was Ellie. Look, you think my stepfather's dead, don't you? I'm not sure what I think. If he is dead, though, when do you think... Well, as I say, I just don't know. Can't you guess? Not to you, no. OK, let me tell you what's worrying me. You think Mum's had something to do with all this, don't you? As I say, I agree with you. She may well have had, for all I know, and good luck to her if she did. But if she did, it must have been before that Wednesday. You know why? Because she doesn't know this, but I've been keeping an eye on her since then, and there's no way she could have done it after. After what? Asked Morse quietly. Look, I've read about the Pitt Rivers business. What if that knife was stolen on the Wednesday afternoon to give everybody the impression that the murder, if there is a murder, was committed after that Wednesday afternoon? You see what I mean? OK, the knife was stolen then, but what if it wasn't used? What if the murder was committed with a different knife? Go on. Well, that's it, really. Isn't that enough? You realise what you're saying, don't you? If your stepfather has been murdered, if he was murdered before the theft of the knife, then your mother's under far more suspicion, not less. Ellie looked down at the avocado-coloured carpet and sipped her champagne. Would you like me to go and get a packet of cigarettes? Morse drained his glass. Yes. Whilst she was gone, Morse sat back and wondered exactly what it was Ellie Smith was trying to tell him, or what it was she was trying not to tell him. The point she had just made was exactly the one which he himself rather proudly had made to Lewis, except that she'd made it rather better. Now, second thing, she said, as each of them sat drinking again and now smoking, I want to ask you a favour. Me and Ashley I wondered, if you'd come along to the registry office and be a witness. Why me? Because, well, no reason really, perhaps, except I'd like you to be there with me mum. When is it, the wedding? Wedding? Sounds a bit posh, doesn't it? We'll just get married, no bridesmaids, no bouquets, not like all the razzmatazz you probably had at your wedding. Morse looked down at the carpet, as she had done earlier, then looked up again. For a second or two it was as though an electric current had shot across his forehead, and for some strange reason he found himself wanting to reach out across the table and just for a moment touch the hand of the young woman seated opposite. How are you getting home, Ellie? In the taxi, Iffley Road, then the top of Banbury Road, Morse had instructed, Ellie had interlaced her fingers into his, and Morse felt moved and confused, and more than just a little loving. Do you see that watercolour? She asked. The one just by our table? No. It was lovely, with fields and sheep and clouds. The clouds were white at the top, and then a sort of middling, muddy grey, and then a darker grey at the bottom. Clouds are like that, aren't they? Are they? Morse had never consciously contemplated a cloud in his life, and he felt unable to comment further. It's just that... Well, all I'm trying to say is I enjoyed being with you, that's all. For a little while I felt as though I was on the top of one of them clouds. OK? Back in his flat, Morse looked with some care at the only watercolour he had. The clouds there had been painted exactly as Ellie Smith had said, and he nodded to himself, just a little sadly. In the waiting area of the Churchill Hospital, immediately Mrs. Stevens had been called in to see her specialist, at 10:35 a.m. on Tuesday the 20th of September, Brenda Brooks picked up a surprisingly recent issue of Good Housekeeping and flicked through its glossy pages, but she found it difficult to concentrate on any particular article. Brenda was a person who took much pleasure in the simple things of life, and two of her greatest delights were cleanliness and tidiness. What a joy she felt each week, for example, when she watched the dustman casually hurl her black bags into the back of the rubbish cart. You could put almost anything into those black bags. Blood-stained shirts, shoes, trousers, anything. Then there were those strong transparent bags which Ted had brought home a couple of years ago. A stack of them in the garden shed, just to the left of the lawn-mower, stout, heavy-duty, not easily torn. Never could she have imagined, of course, that the disposal of a body would cause a problem in her gentle, undemanding life. As Mrs. Stevens had said, there was a pretty big problem of logistics. But Brenda had seen to it. The stiffish, transparent bags measured 28 inches by 36 inches, and Brenda had taken 3. After slitting open the bottom of 2 of them, she'd stitched the 3 together cunningly with some garden string. She had then repeated the process and prepared a second envelope, then a third. And although the insertion of the body into the first, the second and the third of the winding sheets had been a traumatic event, it had not involved too troublesome an effort physically. Not for her, anyway. Edward Brooks had been almost ready for disposal. Almost. By some happy chance, the roll of old brown carpet, which had stood for over 2 years just to the right of the lawn-mower, measured 6 feet by 6 feet. Ideal. It must be expected that such an experience would permanently have traumatized the soul of such a delicate woman as Mrs. Brenda Brooks. But strangely enough, such was not the case. And as she thought back on those things, and flicked through another few pages of Good Housekeeping, and waited for Mrs. Stevens to re-emerge, she found herself half smiling, if not with cruelty, at least with a grim satisfaction. "Things are going a bit slow, sir," said Sergeant Lewis the following morning as he sat in Morse's office at HQ. "That," said Morse, "is a figure of speech the literati call hyperbole. What I think you're trying to tell me is that we're grinding to a dead halt, right?" Lewis nodded, and Morse nodded. They were both right. Considerable activity had centred on the Brooks household following the findings of the bicycle, with Brenda Brooks herself gladly cooperating. In a gentle, nervous recantation, she was now willing, she said, to tell the police the whole truth. Brooks had gone out on his bike early-ish that morning. He had returned in a taxi, late-ish that morning, with a good deal of blood on his clothing. Somehow she'd got him into bed, and then, fairly soon afterwards, she'd called the ambulance, for she had suddenly realised he was very ill. The blood-stained clothing she had put into a black bag and taken to the Redbridge Waste reception area the following morning. The police could look around the house, of course they could. She fully understood. Murder, after all, was a serious business. There'd been just that one discovery which had raised a few eyebrows, including the eyebrows of Brenda Brooks. Although only £217 was in Brooks's bank account, a building society book, found in a box beside Brooks's bed, showed a very healthy balance of £19,500. "You think he's dead, sir?" "Every day that goes by makes it more likely." "We need a body, though." "They're certainly never going to let us find the body." "Why do you say that?" "Because if he's found, he won't have the Pitt Rivers knife stuck in him at all. And that would mean the alibis they've fixed up for themselves gone for a Burton." Several apparently disparate events then occurred between the 21st and 24th of September. On Wednesday, September the 21st, Julia Stevens rang the JR2 to ask for the latest bulletin on Kevin Costin, who the previous day had been transferred to the intensive care unit. His doctors had been increasingly concerned about a blood clot in the brain, and a decision would very shortly be taken about possible surgery. The message, couched in conventionally cautious terms, was critical but stable. Not very promising, Julia realised that. Considerably better, though, than the prognosis on her own condition. Photographs of the 3 young men involved in the Eastern Ring Road accident had appeared in The Star, a free newspaper distributed throughout Oxford each Thursday. The face of Kevin Costin caught the attention of one of the attendants at the Pitt Rivers Museum. In particular, the sight of the small crucifix earring had jerked his jaded memory into overdrive. Earlier, the police had questioned all of them about whether they could remember anything unusual, or anyone unusual, on that Wednesday afternoon when Cabinet 52 had been forced. Like each of his colleagues, he had to admit that he couldn't. But now he could. Just before the museum closed on Thursday 22nd of September, he knocked on the door of the administrator, capital A. Late that same afternoon, Morse asked Lewis an unusual question. "If you had to get a wedding present, what sort of thing would you have in mind for the bride?" "Well, they'll have a list, like as not." "Ellie Smith, is it?" "Yes." Morse hesitated. "It's just that I'd like to buy her something, for herself." Well, there's nothing to stop you giving her a personal present. Just forget the wedding bit. Perfume, say? Scarf? Brooch? Pendant? Yes. A nice little pendant, perhaps. The phone rang. It was the administrator. The two rivers, the Thames, or Isis, and the Cherwell, making their confluence just to the south of the city centre, have long provided enjoyable amenities for Oxford folk, both town and gown: punting, rowing, sculling, canoeing, and pleasure boating. The 50-passenger steamer, the Iffley Princess, sailed from Folly Bridge at 9:15 a.m. on Sunday the 25th of September. Its course took it past such landmarks as the Green Bank, the Gut, the concrete bridge at Donnington, Haystack's Corner and Rest, before arriving at Iffley Lock. As the Iffley Princess rounded the Gut, several passengers on the port side now spotted something potentially sinister. A foot or so below the surface of the nacre green water, something wrapped up, but something no longer wholly concealed. Morse had taken the sensible, almost unprecedented precaution of refraining from a few pints of beer on a Sunday lunchtime, and at 3:15 p.m. he and Lewis stood in the path lab beside the prone body of Edward Brooks, the plastic bags now folded neatly at his feet, like the linen wraps at the resurrection. Apart from Dr. Laura Hobson, the police pathologist, two further forensic assistants and a fingerprint expert stood quite cheerfully around the body, in which the handle of a broad knife stood up straight. Yet it was not the handle itself, so carefully dusted now with fingerprint powder, which riveted Morse's attention. It was the label attached to the side of the handle, a label whose lettering, though washed and smudged by the waters of the Thames, was still partially legible. "I just do not believe this," whispered Morse slowly. The following day, Monday the 26th of September, both Morse and Lewis arrived fairly early, just after 7 a.m. at Thames Valley HQ. Morse himself had slept poorly, his eyeballs ceaselessly circling in their sockets throughout the night, as the dramatic new development in the case had gradually established itself in the pattern of his thinking. For in truth he had been astonished at the discovery that Brooks had been murdered after the theft of the African knife. Murdered, in fact, by the African knife. As he had hitherto analysed the case, assessing motive and opportunity and means, Morse had succeeded in convincing himself that two or perhaps three persons, acting to some degree in concert, had probably been responsible for Brooks's murder. Three suspects. Three women. The superficially gentle Brenda Brooks, who had suffered sorely in the role of neglected and maltreated wife, the enigmatic Mrs. Stevens, who had developed a strangely strong bond with her cleaning lady, and the stepdaughter, Eleanor Smith. Women set apart from the rest of their kind by the sign of the murderer, by the mark of Cain. For almost an hour, Morse and Lewis had spoken together that morning, spoken of thoughts, ideas, hypotheses, and when he returned from the canteen with 2 cups of coffee at 8 a.m, Lewis stated starkly the simple truth they both had to face. "I just don't see how Brenda Brooks or this Mrs. Stevens could have done it. All right, they've got enough motive, but I just don't see when they had the opportunity." "Nor do I," said Morse quietly. "So, unless we're looking in completely the wrong directions, eh?" But Morse was only half listening. "Unless," Lewis had just said. "Lewis, get the car and nip along and have a word with the headmaster of the Proctor Memorial. Tell him we'd like to see Mrs. Stevens again, and while you're at it, you can drop me off at the Path Lab. I want another quick word with the lovely Laura." Coming out of her lab to greet Morse, Dr. Laura Hobson appeared incongruously contented with her work. "Looks as if they've got some vague prints all right on the knife. I'll keep my fingers crossed for you." "Thank you." Morse hesitated. "It may sound a bit far-fetched, I know, but—" "Yes?" "The knife. I'm doing a little bit of hoping myself. The knife used to murder McClure was very similar to—" Morse nodded towards the main lab. "To the knife that was stolen from the Pitt Rivers." "Yes, I knew that. What I was wondering is this. Is there any possibility at all, that Brooks was murdered with another knife? One of the same type, one with the same sort of blade. Then for the knife you've got in there, the one with the possible prints on it, to be stuck in him afterwards. A few hours later, a day even."
With a sad smile, she shook her head. No chance. Unless your murderer's got the luck of the devil and the skill of a brain surgeon. Don't you want to see the contents of his pockets? I suppose I ought to, yes. She looked at him curiously. It's as if you've been putting your faith in something, isn't it? And I feel I've let you down. I lost all my faith a long time ago, I'm afraid. Much better to have evidence in our job. Morse nodded and followed Laura Hobson's shapely legs into the side room, where she gestured to a table by the window. I'll leave you to it, Chief Inspector. Morse sat down and first looked through the official in-possession property form, listing the items found on Brooks's person. It was only a bunch of 7 keys, which appeared to Morse worthy of some brief consideration. The biggest looked like a door key, as perhaps did the 2 Yale keys. The other 4 were possibly for things like a garden shed or a bicycle lock or a briefcase or... But Morse's brain was suddenly engaged now. The 4th small key, a sturdy, silvery key, had the number X10 stamped on it, and Morse gazed through the window and wondered. Was it one of a set of keys? A key to what? A key to where? Would it help to spend a few hours sorting out these keys and matching them up to their locks? Probably a waste of time, but he ought to do it, he knew that. So he would do it, or rather he'd get Lewis to do it. He was standing up now, preparing to leave, when Laura came back. Phone call for Morse, Sergeant Lewis. Lewis was ringing from the Proctor Memorial School. Mrs. Julia Stevens had been granted leave from her duties. She would not be returning to school, ever. She'd only a few months to live. She wasn't at home, though. She'd gone away on a brief holiday abroad with a friend. Destination unknown. "Do we know who the friend is?" asked Morse. "Well, you do, don't you?" "I could make a guess." "Makes you wonder if they're guilty after all." "Or innocent," suggested Morse slowly. The condition of Kevin Costin was markedly improved. With no surgery now deemed necessary, he had been removed from the ICU the previous lunchtime, and already the police had been given permission to interview him. But although he was reluctantly willing to talk about the ram raiding and stolen vehicles, he would say nothing whatsoever about the murder of Edward Brooks. He may have lied and cheated his way through life, but there was one promise now that he was never going to break. At 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday the 27th of September, Morse walked down the High from Carfax. There were several esteemed jewellers' shops there, and he looked in their windows. He was uncertain whether his errand was being made easier or more difficult by his strong suspicion now that it had been Eleanor Smith who had murdered her stepfather, the same Eleanor who had formally identified the body the previous day. "How much is that?" he asked a young female assistant in the shop just across from the covered market. "It's a nice little pendant, isn't it, sir? Only £35. Only." Morse looked down at the tiny oval. "St. Christopher, is it?" "St. Anthony, sir." So Morse made his purchase and started walking once again up towards Carfax. He was ready for the interview. When earlier he had rung Eleanor Smith, she'd sounded in no way surprised that the police should wish to take her fingerprints, for elimination purposes, as Morse had emphasised, and she agreed to come along to Thames Valley HQ. Now, after rolling the little finger of her left hand across the pad, after pressing it firmly onto the fingerprint form, Eleanor Smith had finished, and Lewis asked her to add her signature to the form. "That didn't take very long, did it?" said Morse patronisingly. "Does all this mean you found some fingerprints on the knife?" she asked. Morse was slightly hesitant. "We think so, yes. Unidentified as yet." She looked rather weary. Gone was the sparkle of that champagne evening at the old parsonage. "And when exactly am I supposed to have murdered that shithouse?" She looked from one to the other, and Morse, in turn, looked to Lewis, the interlocutor. "Perhaps," said Lewis slowly, "when you got back from Birmingham that Wednesday." "I see." She produced a small pasteboard business card and handed it to Morse. "I met a fellow on the train that Wednesday, and he got a bit friendly-like. Said if I ever wanted, work or anything." Morse looked at the white card. Mike Williamson, Modelling and Photographic Agency, with a Reading address and telephone number. "You remember me for sure, Inspector,"
Better check, Lewis. But as Lewis got up and moved towards the phone, Morse held up his hand. Office next door, please. Why did you want him out of the way? Morse ignored the question, feeling quite irrationally jealous. What did he offer you? Oh, Christ, come off it! Her eyes flashed angrily now. He just thought I was an intelligent, ill-educated, expensive prostitute, which I am. Which you were. What about Mr. Davies? When you're married, that's all off. I just can't go through with it. I could never love him, so it's not fair, is it? On him or me? There wouldn't have been any wedding anyway, though, would there? Not if you're going to arrest me. For a brief while the two looked at each other across the desk, their eyes locked together with a curiously disturbing intimacy. Morse took a little black box from the drawer and handed it to her. It's not wrapped up, I'm afraid. I'm not much good at that sort of thing. She held the box in her left hand and opened it with her right, taking hold of the gold chain lovingly and gently, and slowly lifting up St. Anthony. Oh, God, she whispered. Do you like it? It's the most wonderful. But she could get no further. She stood up and walked around the desk and kissed Morse fully and softly on the mouth, and Morse felt the wetness of her cheek against his own. You know what I just said about Ashley? That I couldn't marry him because I didn't love him. Well, that wasn't really the reason why I broke it off. In his brain, Morse had become convinced that Eleanor Smith must be guilty of her stepfather's murder. But in his heart he felt grieved as he awaited her words, for he knew exactly what they would be. Yet he was wrong, spectacularly wrong. The real reason is I've fallen in love with somebody else. Morse wondered if he'd heard correctly. What? You getting deaf or something? Not with that charlatan from the modelling agency, surely. She shook her head crossly. Can't you guess? Can't you see? She was standing beside the door, her head held high, her sludgy green eyes closed, trying so hard to hold back the brimming tears. I've fallen in love with you, you stupid sod! Morse was perfectly happy on Friday, September the 30th, to delegate the fingerprinting of Mesdames Brooks and Stevens to Lewis, for the two overseas travellers had returned to Oxford early that afternoon. Neither had appeared to show any undue surprise or discomfiture when Lewis, accompanied by a fingerprint officer, trotted out the purely for elimination line. After his colleague had left for the fingerprint bureau at St. Aldate's, where there was now a computerised search facility, Lewis had returned to HQ to find Morse dispiritedly scanning some of the documents in the case. "Did you have any lunch earlier, sir?" "Not even a pint," complained Morse, lighting a cigarette. "What about coming back and having a bite with us? The missus would be only too glad to knock something up for you. Egg and chips on Friday." "You're on," decided Morse. "Give her a ring and tell her to peel another few spuds." It was Lewis himself who took the call from the fingerprint bureau half an hour later. No match anywhere. Whoever it was who'd left fingerprints on the African knife, it had not been Mrs. Brenda Brooks or Mrs. Julia Stevens, nor, as they had already learned, Miss Eleanor Smith. There was no need to relay the message, since a glum-looking Morse had heard it all anyway. "I'll see you there, sir, if you don't mind. About 6, is that all right?" "What are you going to do?" "Oh, lots of little things. Make a bit more progress with the keys for a start. I'm expected at the Pitt Rivers in 20 minutes. After Lewis had left, Morse lit another cigarette and leaned back in the black leather chair, looking purposelessly around his office. He noticed the thin patina of nicotine on the emulsioned walls. Suddenly, he felt a brief frisson of excitement. But try as he might, he was unable to isolate the elusive clue. And soon he knew it was no use trying any more. It had gone. "We shall have to eat here in the kitchen, Inspector, all right?" "Wherever, Mrs. Lewis. We've got the decorators in, see? You just go and sit down in the lounge. I put out some beer." As he passed the dining room, Morse looked inside. The decorators had almost finished, it seemed. All the furniture was now pushed back into place, except for a bookcase, which stood awkwardly in mid-room. Clearly, though, there would be no problem about its relocation. for the site of its former habitation was marked by an oblong of strawberry-red carpet to the left of the window. Mrs. Lewis was suddenly behind him. "You were looking at the carpet, weren't you now?" she said. "Only had it 5 years, and they told us the colours would last till eternity." "I suppose everything fades," said Morse. It hardly seemed a profound observation, not at the time. "It's the sun, really, see? On the linings for the cupboards, you hardly get any fading at all." Morse moved on into the lounge and was watching the 6 o'clock news when Lewis came in. "You look pleased with yourself," said Morse. "That little X10 key, remember? That's a Pitt Rivers key, to a wall safe there with keys to all the display cabinets." Morse grunted a perfunctory "well done," and he reverted his attention to the news. Mrs. Lewis produced a slightly unladylike whistle a few minutes later. "On the table, boys!" As Morse jolted out some tomato sauce, Lewis picked up his knife and fork. "You know, sir, if they ever find a body with an empty plate of egg and chips beside it—" "I think you mean a plate empty of egg and chips, Lewis." "Well, I reckon if the fingerprints on the knife don't match any of those in our criminal library, the odds are they'll probably be mine." Morse nodded, picked up his own knife and fork, and then he froze. "Everything all right, sir?" "Bloody hell," whispered Morse. "Bloody hell, you've done it again, Lewis!" Unprecedentedly, Lewis was moved to lay down both knife and fork. "I'd like to bet you, Lewis, that I know whose fingerprints are on that knife in Brooks's back. You see, there's a regular procedure which every CID man knows all about, a procedure that couldn't have been followed in this case, that when you take fingerprints at the scene of any murder, you take everybody's, including the corpse's." Lewis felt the blood in his veins growing cold, like the plate in front of him. "You can't mean—" "But I do, Lewis. That's exactly what I mean. The prints are those of Edward Brooks himself." How did one explain those virtually inexplicable convolutions of the mind which occasionally led to some penny-dropping moment? It was all to do with the fortuitous collocation of several memories in Morse's mind. The interview with Mrs. Rodway, and that oblong patch above the radiator where a picture had been hanging. Then, that very evening, a second oblong in the lounge there, and when Mrs. Lewis had spoken of the unfading linings in her cupboards. And working backwards, or was it forwards, there'd been the administrator of the Pitt Rivers pointing out the fine quality of the Hessian lining for her cabinet exhibits. Then again, a much more distant memory from childhood of a case of cutlery, where over the years each knife, fork and spoon had left its own imprint on the blue plush lining of the case. Things always left their impression, did they not? Or did they? Yes. All the constituents were there, separate though and unsynthesized, waiting for a catalyst. Lewis. Lewis the catalyst. For it was Lewis who had returned with the information that the small key fitted a wall safe in the museum, in which, in turn, were to be found other keys, including the key to Cabinet 52. It was Lewis, too, who so innocently had asserted, as he picked up a knife to eat his meal, that his own fingerprints would soon be found thereon. And whither had such ratiocination finally led the chief inspector, as, like Abraham, he'd made his way forth from his tent in the desert, knowing not whither he went? To that strangest of all conclusions, that on Wednesday the 7th of September, from Cabinet 52 in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, nothing whatsoever had been stolen. A council of war was called on Sunday the 2nd of October, with 3 other officers joining Chief Superintendent Strange in the latter's Kidlington HQ office at 10 a.m. Morse, Phillotson and Lewis. Morse, invited to put a case for a series of warrants, did so with complete conviction. Certain it was that Brooks went to visit McClure and murdered him. On the way home on his bicycle, he suddenly became aware that he was seriously ill. The one thing above all that must have haunted Brooks, once he knew he would recover from the heart attack, was that he was still in possession of the knife he'd used to murder McClure, because whatever happened he couldn't throw it away. He ordered his wife to lock it up, and she did as he asked. On the Saturday afternoon before McClure's murder, Brooks had taken the knife from Cabinet 52, fully intending to replace it the following Monday morning. But Brooks couldn't restore the knife. Not yet. His great hope was that no one would notice its absence, and no one did. Apart from the attendant circumstance of so many other knives, One further factor was greatly in his favour. The cabinet had been recently relined, and there was no outwardly physical sign that any object could be missing. Brooks had only to move 2 or 3 other knives along a little to effect a balanced row of exhibits, and as day followed day, no one, in fact, noticed that anything at all was missing. But apart from Brooks, 2 other people now knew of all this, one of whom was Julius Stevens. And the beautifully clever idea was born. If Brooks were to be murdered with the very same knife which he himself had stolen, 2 things only were required. First, a different but wholly similar knife would have to be planted in or around Daventry Avenue, for when it was found, the police, with a little luck, would discover that it had been taken from one of the Brookses' kitchen drawers. Second, Cabinet 52 would have to be broken into, so that its contents would inevitably be checked, for then the pedigree of the missing knife would become known. Someone was therefore delegated to break open that cabinet, to ruffle around a few of the knives there, exactly the opposite of what Brooks had done, and the deception was launched, and above all, the crucial alibis were established. The only thing now calling for some sort of explanation was the curious circumstance of Brooks's body being so elaborately wrapped up before being dumped in the Isis. Well, as Morse saw it, the reason was fairly obvious. When the body was found, such wrapping would ensure that the knife was still in it. There would be no danger of it being lost, and thereby no danger that the alibis would be destroyed. So, you see, finished Detective Chief Inspector Morse, the 2 women we assumed could never have murdered Brooks have overnight moved to the top of the list. He looked up with a fairly satisfied smile to Chief Superintendent Strange. And with your permission, sir, we shall apply for a couple of search warrants.
Why only 2 warrants? Asked Detective Chief Inspector Phillotson. The following day a call was put through to Morse from Mr. Basil Shepston at Churchill Hospital, and 20 minutes later the 2 men were seated together in the senior neurologist's consulting room. Mrs. Julia Stevens had been admitted at midday. Somewhere on the brain, pressure had become intolerably severe. Yet somehow she had managed to make it clear that she wished to speak to Morse. Twice during the early afternoon her behaviour had become disturbingly aggressive, but some fairly fundamental personality change was almost inevitable with such a tumour.
"Had you noticed any personality change before?" asked Morse.
Shepston hesitated.
"Well, the commonest symptom would be a general loss of inhibition. She's an attractive woman, isn't she?"
Shepston looked across at Morse keenly.
"I know what you're thinking, and the answer's probably yes. I rather think that if, over these past few months, someone had asked to go to bed with her, well—"
Morse nodded. For a while, when Julia had regained some measure of her senses in the hospital, she knew the words she wanted to say. About seeing Morse, or at least her mind knew, yet she was aware that those words were not the words she'd actually used. 1001, 1002. But she could write. How could that be if she couldn't speak? No matter, she could write. Morse placed a hand lightly on her right arm and smiled at her, and she smiled back, but tightly, for she was willing herself to make him understand what so desperately she wished to tell him. The words were in her mind, words that were all untrue but ready to be spoken. She had only to repeat them to herself. I murdered him. I murdered him. I murdered him. And now she looked up at Morse and forced herself to speak those self-same words. 1003, 1004, 1005. Aware, it seemed, even as she spoke, of her calamitous shortcomings, she looked around her with frenzied exasperation to find the pencil with which earlier she'd managed to write Morse. Her right arm flailed about her wildly, knocking over a glass of orange juice, and tears of frustration sprang in her eyes. Suddenly 3 nurses were at her side, 2 of them seeking to hold her still, while the 3rd administered a further sedative, and Morse, who had intended to plant a tender kiss upon the Titian hair, was hurriedly ushered away. Events were now moving quickly towards their close. The 3 search warrants had been authorised on Monday the 3rd of October, and at the Brooks residence had proved dramatically effective. In the garden shed, fibres of brown material had been found which later proved to be identical to the carpet that had covered the body of Edward Brooks. Brenda Brooks, therefore, had been taken in for questioning, and later had been formally charged with complicity to murder. Earlier the same day, a forensic team had examined Julia Stevens' ancient Volvo and discovered in the boot fibres of the same brown material. Yes, things were progressing well, and quickly. There was that third search warrant, of course, the one yet to be served on Miss Smith, of whom, as it happened, Morse had dreamed the previous night, most disturbingly. Semi-dressed in a plunging Versace creation, she had exhibited herself erotically to some lecherous yuppie in the back of a BMW, and when Morse had awoken, he had felt bitterly angry with her and heart-achingly jealous. He had known better nights, better dreams. Yet life is a strange affair, and on the Tuesday afternoon, October the 4th, Morse received a call from reception which quickened his heartbeat considerably. At reception she had quickly made her errand clear. "Is he expecting you, miss?" asked the man seated there. "No." "Can I ask what it's in connection with?" "A murder." So Ellie Smith walked over the darkly marbled floor to a small waiting area. To her left was a flight of stairs, down which Morse was coming towards her. "Good to see you. Come along up." "No, I can't stay. I've got a car waiting." "But we can take you home. I can take you home." "No, I'm sorry." "Why have you come?" asked Morse, seating himself beside her. "Mum's told me all about it. She's on bail, isn't she? And I just wondered where it all leaves her, and me, for that matter. She told me you might be bringing me in, is that right?" "Look, we can't really talk here. Please, come up." "Not unless you're arresting me. Anyway, I don't trust myself in that office of yours, remember?" "Look, about your mother. You'll have to face the fact that she was involved in some way with the murder of your stepfather." Morse had chosen his hesitant words carefully. "All right, if you're not going to tell me, never mind." She stood up, and Morse stood up beside her. She held out a small parcel she had been carrying in her right hand. "What is it?" "Promise me one thing." "If I can." "You won't open it till you get home tonight." "If you say so." Morse suddenly felt very moved, very lost, very helpless, very upset. "Well, that's it then. Hope you'll like it." She managed to speak the words, but only just, as she picked up St. Anthony and fondled him between the thumb and forefinger of her left hand. And almost, for a moment or two, as they stood there, it was as if they might embrace. But the Assistant Chief Constable suddenly came through reception, raising his hand to Morse in friendly greeting. She turned away and left. As she stepped out of the building, a red BMW was beside her immediately, and she got in, casting one lingering look behind her as she locked her safety belt. "I was rather hoping you'd bring her up, sir. She's getting a bit of a smasher, that one, don't you think?" But Morse, reclosing the door quietly behind him, made no reply. Suddenly his life seemed joyless and desolate. "Coffee, sir?" asked Lewis in a low voice, perhaps understanding many things. Morse nodded. After Lewis had gone, he didn't wait. He couldn't wait. Inside the bluebell patterned paper was a small silver hip flask. Oh, God. The letter enclosed with it bore no salutation. "Me mum rang me up and told me everything, but she never killed him. I know that better than anybody, because I killed him. I'm not much cop at writing, but I wish we could have gone out for champers together again. That was the happiest night of my life, because for some cockeyed reason I loved you with all the love that I've got. I hope you like the little present. If only you'd known how much I wanted you to kiss me in the taxi. So some few kisses now from me. XXX, Ellie. XXXX. Unmanned with anguish, Morse turned away as Lewis came back with the coffee, folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer of his desk. Neither man spoke. Then Morse opened the drawer, took out the letter and passed it over to Lewis. The silence persisted long after Lewis had read it. Finally, Morse got to his feet. "If I ever see her again, Lewis,
I shall have to tell her that rang is the more correct form of the past tense of the verb to ring, when used transitively. Morse passed over the hip flask. Remember that crossword clue, Lewis? Kick in the pants, 3-5. Lewis nodded and smiled sadly. Hip flask. You think she's done a bunk, sir? Sure she has. Half an hour later, in Princess Street, it became clear that Ellie Smith had decamped in considerable haste. Not much here in the drawers, sir. An appointments book, though, stuck at the back. Which I'm not particularly anxious to see, said Morse, sitting himself down on the bed. Sir, there's a telephone number here for that Tuesday, the 6th, with something written after it. GL. Morse got up and went to look over Lewis's shoulder. Shall I give the number a go? Morse shrugged his shoulders. Please yourself. A clear Welsh voice answered. Lonsdale College, Gareth Llewellyn-Jones, can I help you? Thames Valley Police, sir. We're investigating a murder. We think you might be able to help us confirm one or two things. My goodness me. Well, I can't really, not for the moment. I'm in the middle of a tutorial, see? Can you give me a time when you will be free, sir? Could be important, said Lewis, after putting the phone down. If she was out all night, she couldn't have had too much of a hand in things with Brooks. Of course she did, snapped Morse. I don't believe her when she says she murdered him, though. She's just trying to shield her mother, that's all, because it was her mother who murdered him. After Lewis had dropped Morse, he proceeded to Lonsdale College, where his mission was quietly and quickly productive. Llewellyn-Jones freely admitted that he'd met the young woman he'd always known as Kay fairly regularly for sexual purposes. More often than not in a hotel, but twice at her own little place, as was the case on Tuesday the 6th of September, when he'd spent the evening with her, and would have spent longer, but for a phone call. 9:30, 9:45, which had galvanised her into panicky activity. Obviously some sort of emergency, but he knew no more, except perhaps that the voice on the phone was that of a woman. Lewis thanked the dark, dapper little Welshman, and as he drove up to his home in Headington, he realised that Morse had almost certainly been right about Ellie Smith's involvement in the murder. The subject of Lewis's inquiry had hurriedly wiped her eyes and for a considerable time said nothing after getting into Mike Williamson's car. Her thoughts were temporarily concentrated not so much on Morse himself as on what she could have told him, or rather on what she could never have told him. It had been that terrible Tuesday night when her mother had phoned, pleading in such deep anguish for her daughter's help. When she'd got rid of that quite likeable, cock-happy little Welshman and finally reached the house to find her mother standing like a zombie in the hall. And when, after going into the kitchen, she'd looked down on her stepfather, lying prone on the lino there, a strange-looking knife stuck between the shoulder blades. Then the red-headed woman had arrived and taken over. It was as if the plot of the drama had already been written, for clearly the appropriate props had been duly prepared, waiting to be fetched from the garden shed, just the timing, it appeared, had gone wrong, a mother jumping the starting gate. 10 minutes later, following a rapidly spoken telephone conversation, the young man had appeared, a young man whom, oddly enough, she knew by sight, since the two of them had attended the same martial arts classes together. But she had said nothing to him, and he seemed hardly aware of her presence as he began to manoeuvre the awkward corpse into its polythene winding sheets. She'd even found herself remembering his name, Kevin something. As the car turned into the station, Ellie's mind jerked back to the present, as Mike Williamson reminded her of their proposed agreement. "You ring me like you said, OK?" Ellie nodded. "We can do real business with a body like yours, kid." It would have been a nice gesture if he'd offered to carry her cases as far as the ticket window. But he didn't, and of that she was glad. Had he done so, she probably would have felt obliged to buy a ticket for Paddington, for she had spoken to him vaguely of friends in London. As it was, once he'd driven off, she bought a single ticket to Liverpool and crossed the footbridge to platform 2. She stood for 25 minutes, forgetting for a while the future plight of her mother, forgetting the minor role she herself had played in the murder of a man she had learned to hate, yet remembering again now, as she fingered the gold pendant, the man who had given it to her, the man for whom she would have sacrificed anything, if only he could have loved her.
On Thursday, the 20th of October, Mrs. Brenda Brooks was rearrested, additionally charged with the murder of her husband, Mr. Edward Brooks, and remanded in custody at Holloway Prison, from which institution, 4 days later, she was granted temporary leave of escorted absence to attend a midday funeral service at the Oxford Crematorium, where many teachers from the Proctor Memorial School were squeezed into the smaller chapel there, together with a few of Julia Stevens' relatives and friends. 2 others almost completed the saddened congregation: the facially scarred Kevin Costin and a pale-looking Chief Inspector Morse, neither of whom participated in what seemed to the latter a banal revision of Archbishop Cranmer's noble words for the solemn service of the dead. Morse knew, of course, that it would be utterly hopeless to ring Ellie Smith, and therefore he rang her number only 3 times in the week following her disappearance, only twice in the second week. After all, as Morse recalled from his believing days, hope is one of the greatest of all the Christian virtues. In the 3rd week, his normal routine appeared to reassert itself, and at about 9:30 p.m. he was again regularly to be observed walking fairly purposefully down the Banbury Road to one of his local hostelries. He's promised himself that he will dramatically curtail his consumption of alcohol from November the 1st, which same day will also mark his permanent renunciation of nicotine. In the meantime, there's much work still to be done in the aftermath of the case. The aftermath of both cases, rather. And above all else in Morse's life, there remains the searching out of Ellie Smith, since, as a police officer, that is his professional duty, and, as a man, his necessary purpose.